Every old-timer in Elm Creek has their own version of what had happened. Hell, even half the young people think they know how it went down. Don't listen to anyone who wasn't there. It's like that game we used to play as youngster where you take a piece of yarn tied to two cups and pass it around a circle, repeating some message. Telephone. That's what we called it. Only difference is that in Telephone, the story starts as something simple and gets more and more ridiculous as it goes. But this story, it gets more and more plausible the younger the teller. Almost like it's too much to be believed. So listeners, correct for realism when they retell it, so as not to sound crazy. My own grandson told me the other day that I remember it wrong, that it was all just some tragic accident and an albino bear. Something ain't right about that. 12-year-old kid telling his grandfather what he should and shouldn't remember. So, don't listen to the young people. They weren't there. Truth is, most of us old folk weren't there neither. The way we talk, you'd guess every miner in town was caught up in it all. Like how every boomer will tell you he was at Woodstock. It was only maybe 20 of us. Of those, aside more than half are dead and buried. Except for old Rashi Singh. Bastard had himself cremated. I'll start over. You'll forgive me if I repeat myself. 1956. Like near every other young man, I worked the mines. Hard work, but honest. Plus, nothing else paid as good. Nothing I was qualified for, at any rate. And I had a wife, one child, and another on the way to support. Besides, my friends were miners. Ralph Hatfield, Rashnik Singh, and Sid McNamara. We'd usually hit the bars after work, me leaving early on account of the family, and Rashi would order juice. Now, Ralph didn't much care for the bartender. Most of us didn't. Jesse felt tended bar not because he was especially good at it, but because he didn't have the stomach for a man's work. He even hired kids to mow his lawn and do landscaping. Wasn't ashamed of it neither. Thought it made him smarter than the rest of us. I don't know if I ever caught Jesse in town without some fool sideways grin. Ralph suspected that Felt got his job by sleeping with the widowed bar owner. I didn't think so, but it wasn't impossible. Jesse had taken the first fruits, if you'll beg my pardon, of at least 2 girls in town and had nearly half a dozen ex or current lovers. He was smooth with women and had a pretty face, high cheekbones, sharp nose. That was enough reason for most of us to dislike him. Ralph had more claim to hate Felt than most. Y'all who aren't from West Virginia probably know all about the Hatfields and McCoys, but that's water under the bridge compared to the Hatfields and the Felts. See, during the Coal Wars, Hatfields fought for the Unions and Felts owned the mines. But if you gave Jesse a hard time about it, he'd come back with some quip. Felt was always a funny guy. That, combined with the fact that he never got angry, kept the rest of us from truly hating him, save Ralph. June 10th was when it all started. Cicada season. They were bad that year, too. So many damn insects you could hydroplane on their guts if your tired treads were bare. The mine was a haven from them. For the workday, at least. You didn't have to listen to the never-ending screech. But this season, the mine was even worse than the outside. It echoed. It isn't even pretty sounding like a cricket. At least not to me. So it's no wonder we worked deeper in than usual. We got far enough that we couldn't hear a peep and went to work. A couple hours into the day, I spotted a neck into a new room, but this one was real narrow. As in, too narrow for most folks to fit through. But Rashi was a skinny guy and could damn near fit through the bars on a baby's crib. Anytime there was a crack the rest of us were nervous to slide through, Sang had it covered. We waited around for no more than 10 minutes before Rashi squeezed back towards us. I'd never seen the man so excited. "Stop all other mining," he said with a thick accent. "It's a treasure room." In most mines, the demolitions expert calculates the proper amount of black powder, and then everyone draws straws on who has to light the fuse. But most mines didn't employ Sid McNamara, the craziest son of a bitch I ever knew. Sid did all the blasting himself. He loved to be as close to the explosion as sanity allowed. Most of us figured he'd go the way of his Ireland-born grandfather and die in such a blast. But he blew the neck wide open without a vent, and we all had a look for ourselves at Rashi's treasure room. What we saw was a gold mine. Well, no, it wasn't. It was a coal mine, but it was a hell of a lot of coal and mighty easy to collect. The owner was ecstatic. He hired everyone in town not already working for him at twice the normal rate. Even Felt couldn't resist a few weeks of hard labor for that kind of cash. We worked like dogs all week, taking as many hours at double pay as possible. Predictably, Jesse was the laziest of us all, but we needed him to have enough energy to pour our drinks after work, so no one said a thing. Now, I'm not sure who saw it. I want to say it was Felt who came strutting back with a proud smile to tell us all of his find. If my memory serves and it was Felt, that's what they call cruel irony. Anyway, Felt or whoever it was found yet another neck, one wide enough that anyone could walk through. The new room was small, but filled with coal. Loose coal, too. That should have made us wary. Coal doesn't just sit on the surface, stacked knee-deep, ready to be scooped into bags. But we were greedy, and now we had 2 rooms to work. A handful of guys I barely knew worked the smaller room. We called it the pirate's chest. I'll admit we were greedy. We robbed pillars and were too aggressive with the cutting machine. But that room should not have collapsed. I've been in natural collapses before, but this was not even one of them. Some of the miners will tell you that everything was quiet and normal like right up until the cave-in, but no, there was one sound. That sound haunts me even still. Most rational explanation is the men of the pirate's chest shouted before the rocks gave way. But I know what I heard. It was a scream, all right. Not a human one. It wasn't a shout of anger or fear. If you asked me how I figure a demon might yawn, I'd tell you I don't have to guess. I know. That sound? That was us waking something up. Something buried under all the coal. The 3 or so men working the treasure room got sucked under the big pile of black like there was some giant hoover underneath. Then the collapse started. It was the big chamber that went first. The one me and my buddies were working. That hallway Sid had blasted out fell in on itself without so much as a groan to warn us. Most were able to run through the corridor in time and make it out. A couple were buried in the rubble, crushed flat as pancakes. Hooper Collins had his leg pinned under a boulder, which would be the death of him. 19 or 20, I think. Guy had a pretty wife and had no kids by her yet. Death sure knows how to pick him. Anyway, when the dust cleared and I was through coughing, I noticed poor Hooper, hollering and screaming. I did my damnedest to roll the rock off his femur. Hadn't finished before Ralph screamed and pointed. A couple of the new recruits had rushed into that small room to avoid the boulders. Stupid bastards. Now, the screams I heard next definitely were human. I didn't watch, but you can't mistake the sound of flesh being yanked apart, so I gave up on Collins and ran for the rest of the survivors. I've tried to forget how he begged me not to run, the words he used. I've failed at that. I ran, not far, just around the corner, and soon, every healthy body was huddled around the cave-in, desperately trying to dig out. It was futile, but I jumped in anyway. What else could I do? When the screams stopped, the eating began. It must have gone on for half an hour. Tearing, cracking, suckling. We all knew what the entree was, and each of us dug all the faster. Eventually, of course, the panic wore off and we had time to think. What was back there? More importantly, what would it do when it finished its meal? And we all knew that we hadn't made progress escaping. West Virginians are just stubborn, I guess. As horrifying as the rending sounds were, the silence was far worse. The dinner was done. Hopefully it was filling. "Damn it! Everyone stop! We need to figure this out!" screamed Sid McNamara. The Irishman held up his lantern and we all faced the light. Over a dozen of us were huddled, some crying, others had shot themselves, but all of us were shaking as if naked in a blizzard. We took a break from the frantic digging and shut up for a moment. All but Rodney, the preacher's son, who fell to his knees and wouldn't stop praying no matter what the rest of us did. Rodney wasn't as holy as his father, but at least one of us asking heaven for help couldn't have hurt. Finally, someone spoke. Ralph Hatfield. He always had a clear head. Even did a couple years of college. He kept his voice lower than Sid had. What with the creature right around the corner, so we leaned in. "It'll take days to dig ourselves out. That thing will get us if dehydration doesn't. And it's guarding the TNT, if that becomes our only option. We can post a watch? Guards to make sure it doesn't come in here?" It was Jesse what said it, trying poorly to maintain his composure. "Are you volunteering? You'd rather stand around than dig like the rest of us?" said Ralph. No, Most of the water and lights are in the room with it, said Sid. We've got it outnumbered. Can it die? Of course, said Ralph. I read a whole issue on undiscovered species in the National Geographic. Most life in the ocean is unknown, and there's all sorts of cave creatures we never knew about. This thing is an animal. Animals can die. What's it eat then? I asked. No one responded for a minute. Then Ralph nodded. The coal. Coal is energy too. Made of carbon. Just like living things. There's beasts out there that digest minerals. They call them lithophiles. Now, I can't speak to the accuracy of Ralph's claims or even the exactness of my memory, but I'd like to think Ralph was right. It was an animal. Don't know that I believe it, though. Around that time, Rodney stopped muttering and shouted at us. It's no animal! It's no natural thing at all! Shut up, man! Hissed Sid through his teeth. It's a demon, drawn to our greed and wickedness. Rod, please, said Jesse Felt, in a whisper. We need to repent. I think it was Sid that walloped him in the back of the head. Not hard enough to knock Rodney unconscious, but with plenty of force to knock him over and shut him up. Fuck, I said, and a few of us took a step back. Right away, Rashi knelt to tend to Rod, giving McNamara a sharp glare. No one else seemed to care. I don't know of many animals that can survive being hit with 8 pickaxes, said someone whose name and face I can't recall. 9, by my count. It was Ralph. He didn't have to tell us the math. That there weren't enough axes for everybody. Rod could barely walk, and Paul had a broken arm, which left me and 2 others to fight with rocks. Sang was a little luckier. He kept a special blade on him everywhere he went. They call it a kirpan, and it's this longish dagger with all sorts of ornament. In the 50s in Appalachia, a knife wouldn't bother anybody. Shoot, back then, it wasn't uncommon for a guy to walk through town with a 6-shooter on his belt. None of us had a gun, of course, but I would have traded my rock for a good knife any day. Biggest threat here is going to be friendly fire. Who was the fellow who said that? Can't get his name. I remember his stories, and that he'd been a sergeant in Korea. Damn, age is a hell of a thing. Anyway, the vet advised us a bit. Watch where you swing, but don't stop hitting it until it stops moving. We quickly drew up a battle plan with Sarge's help, who'd approach from what angle, pairing up with battle partners. The longer we waited, the more we feared we'd lose our nerve. That the creature hadn't made a sound for so long only added to our worries. Was it planning something? Was it even smart enough for plans? As a unit, we rounded the bend and shined our lanterns best we could. Half the standing lights were out, and of the remainder most were knocked over. Little strips of light shined in random directions like some sort of played pattern, but unless it was hiding in the shadows, no creature. Blood and gut trails told a story, that the thing had dragged the dead into the pirate's chest to feast. Hooper's leg was still pinned under the boulder, but there was no sign of the rest of him. No one was eager to be first in line, so we crept towards what had to be the monster's lair real slow, weapons raised. About halfway there, something dropped onto us, or rather, onto Sarge. We hadn't figured an attack from above, so the whole plan was shot. Half of us ran, half attacked. I did a little of both. Before I go farther, I'll try my best to describe the creature. Just keep in mind this was nearly 30 years ago. It moved faster than a rabbit. Light was scarce, and I only ever got a real good look at it once. At least with my eyes. Can't count how many times I've seen it in dreams. But I suppose I saw it well enough for any man. I'm certain it was tall, but how tall? I can't even guess cause it was bent over with twistiest damn pretzel of a spine I ever saw. At least 4 legs and as many arms. And at the end of each limb, a dozen fingers. Or maybe they were antennae? Tentacles? Those spindly legs on a shrimp? Shit, I don't know. I know it didn't have eyes. I remember that well. It only had one thing on its head. The mouth. A cross between the tail of an earwig and a crocodile's maw. But boy, was it skinny. Too skinny for how strong it was. And the flesh didn't look so tough. Translucent. Almost worm-like. Fortunately for it, it had armor. Chitin, I think it's called, if it was a bug. But the plates intersected more like the shell of a crawfish. Any more description would be stretching the truth on my part. Whatever it was, insect or crustacean or demon, it tore the sergeant apart in seconds. I couldn't bring myself to charge in close, so I threw my rock at its head. May as well have thrown a beach ball. Even the axe swings of hardened men weren't making cracks in the carapace. I grabbed the pick Sergeant dropped, or had his hand been lopped off? Either way, I almost stepped in when the thing grabbed Ralph. I'd like to think I would have helped if Rashi hadn't acted first. Sang stuck that holy dagger of his into the monster easy as cutting cake. Your guess is as good as mine why it worked. Maybe the dagger was better quality iron than the picks. Maybe something else. But the thing recoiled without making a sound and Ralph was free. Lucky stab or not. 2 more bodies lay at the thing's feet, and there was nothing to do but run again. At least, that's what everyone thought who wasn't Sid McNamara. In the ruckus, he managed to find a stick of dynamite. "Keep your distance, boys!" he shouted, running back to the fight. Don't get any romantic notion that Sid was a martyr. I knew the man as well as anybody, and he had no intention of dying. Just like he had no plan to slip on a pile of guts, twist his ankle too bad to stand, lose his grip on the explosive, and fail to catch the monster in the blast. All but 1 or 2 of us cleared the explosion, not counting Sid, who went out like everybody had guessed but in circumstances an oracle couldn't have predicted. At least we were alive. Our eyes and ears were none too happy, but the monster seemed worse off, skittering about in random directions, tripping over itself. A sound-driven creature, blinded by the noise maybe. It didn't even react to Rodney screaming for heaven to save him. We didn't have time to play guessing games or grieve our friend's death. We had to leave. Ralph spotted our way out, a chimney blown open by the blast. We'd have to brave the middle of the room, praying the monster would avoid us with its random shuffles. And it would take 2 men to reach the opening, one on the shoulders of the other. What choice did we have? We went for it. I recall Jesse felt weeping as he climbed onto my back, and for a moment, I judged him for it, until I realized I was crying too. To his credit, Felt found a ledge once through the opening, and did his best to pull the rest of us up. Halfway through, Felt and Sang, a couple others having reached safety, the monster grabbed someone. Matthew Stewart, I believe. No one watched him die, and no one tried to help him. I confess feeling a bit of relief, thinking the catch will distract it long enough for us to climb. A sinful thought, sure, but I've committed worse. 8 or 9 of us were left, and of those 2 had lanterns. We shined them upwards, and would you believe that we couldn't even see the roof? I don't know the odds of that. A passage appearing right above us. Straight shot to the surface. "Praise Jesus! We've been delivered!" said Rod. No one could really argue the point. We climbed. I don't know for how long. It was tiring work, but adrenaline's a powerful thing. At first, we braced our backs to one wall and used our legs along the opposite. Then it turned into more like a steep slope we had to scale with our hands. A few outcroppings gave us chances to rest. Sometimes, the mouth would widen, and we could offer support to the weaker men. Others, it would narrow, and we'd have to squeeze through one at a time. In one such shaft, we lost a man. A wide frame can be blessing or curse in a mine, and Liam was just too stout to fit. Even with someone pushing from under and pulling from above, it didn't take long until Liam was wedged so tight he couldn't even go back down. He would have needed to break his shoulders to move. Ralph offered to do just that. Yank his arms out of their sockets, that is. "And keep on climbing how?" Liam asked, then still stuck. The man pulled out a pocket knife and cut his own throat. "No!" Rodney screamed, and all I could think was how fortunate I was to be above him rather than below. It did take breaking his arms to dislodge his corpse. He didn't mind, just fell 10 feet before sticking someplace else. There'd be time to pray for his soul later. We kept on for as long as we could, which wasn't long. No, a few minutes later, and we had come across the worst thing any of us ever had seen, not counting the monster. The ceiling. On cue, one of the lanterns went out. "It can't be," whispered Rodney. "We're trapped." "The odds of it coming out to the surface were always slim," said Ralph, no emotion in his voice. "I just wish we had a few cigarettes to share." "What time is it?" I asked. "Dark probably, by now," said Ralph. Then, They'll send somebody. Where Jesse's confidence came from, I can't say, but I envied it. Maybe there's already a rescue party digging through the rubble. We'll all be home by morning. Is that what you want, Felt? It was Ralph. All our friends and fathers getting themselves killed? No, of course not. Come on, Hatfield. I just mean... Shut up, said Ralph, and he did. No one said much of anything for the next hour. A few sobs, even a couple grim chuckles. I reckon most of us accepted the inevitable in that time. A small part of me held out hope for rescue. There was no way to warn the rescuers, if anyone was coming. Nothing to do at all but wait and make peace with our Creator. Then the last light went out. I doubt you've ever experienced a dark like that one. Sure, maybe you've experienced pitch black. Maybe you've been underground. But I'm talking about the kind of dark that fills your insides, where even a pair of eyes 3 inches from yours don't glow. The kind of dark so deep, you know you won't ever see the light again. The little room we sat ourselves in felt an awful lot smaller all of a sudden, and the rock scraping my back became harder to ignore. There's no one on this earth who I'd wish that sort of death upon. Being buried alive. I would have traded anything just to stretch my arms out. In a way, it was almost like drowning. I'd nearly drowned once, 12 years old. Tried to impress Susan by swimming across a lake. It was fun at first, until it hit me like a baseball bat how much water was between my feet and the lake's floor. I remember clearly how oppressive all that water felt as my head sunk under it. An older girl saved me then, and I didn't even have the wherewithal to be embarrassed by that. Dying underground was similar. All the stone above and below me, for who knows how far. But no 11th grader was coming this time. Of all the things to reach out in mercy, it was the moon. A little stream of blue light above our heads. Took our eyes a bit to adjust and even make the light out. I thought I was hallucinating, until Felt shrieked in joy. The chimney did go all the way to the surface, but only a tiny slit. Not near enough to scurry up. It was like Artemis herself was teasing us. That's the moon goddess, right? Right. I can do it, said Rashi. The hell you can, snapped Ralph. Hey, Rashi placed a hand on Ralph's cheek. I can do it. Have faith. Okay, said Rod. I have faith. Sang took off his boots and his jacket, spit on his palms, and steeled himself. Rashi, I said, I have faith too. I'll be back, he said, with a whole bunch of people. And guns. And guns, added Ralph. Rashi smiled. And guns. Before he left, he paused. I thought he was second-guessing himself. Then he handed me his knife. I thought your religion said you always had to carry this. Sang just laughed. Then up he went. We couldn't see his climb mind. He blocked out the light, but we listened for minutes as we wiggled through the impossibly small opening. At some point, his grunt stopped and I feared he'd suffocated himself. But then he shouted down to us. I made it! I'll be back soon! There still wasn't much conversation as we waited, but at least it no longer felt like drowning. Thank you. Thank you. I'm done with drinking. I'm done with gambling. I'll never stray from my wife again. Rod prayed. Speak for yourself, said a fella I can't remember. First thing I'm doing when we get out of this is having a cold beer. Make that 3. A few of us laughed, a lot louder than the joke was funny, but then I heard it. Shh, I said, and everyone climbed up quick. The air wasn't quiet, though. We could all hear it. Liam's flesh, tearing, then being swallowed. No, 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 said Ronnie. We've been delivered. Why is it back? We were delivered. Sang's coming with guns, said Felt. He'll make it back fast. It took that thing a while to eat the poor fellas last time. We have time. It had more than one body to eat last time, said Ralph. What if it finishes before Rashi returns, I'm not sure if I thought of it on my own, or if it's what Ralph was trying to imply, but a way to buy us a few precious minutes crossed my mind. I didn't voice the plan, though. It was just too damn mean. Rodney voiced it for me. An offering, he said. That thing down there. It's a devil. A demonic spirit. We don't know that, said Ralph. Rodney continued. It's a demon if there ever was one. Demons are drawn to wickedness like moths to a flame. Someone brought it here, and only an offering will satisfy it. An evil offering for an evil thing. What are you trying to say, Rod? Asked Jesse Felt. No one answered, for a moment, but the silence was broken by a bone cracking. Marrow being sucked. Monster was wrapping up his meal. Maybe you're right, Rod, said Ralph. Maybe this devil has wanted a sacrifice all along. Come on, Ralph. You don't believe in that sort of superstition, said Jesse with something that may have been a chortle under different circumstances. Oh, I'm not sure what I believe anymore, Felt. But I know that thing is hungry. And I've got a pretty strong notion who the most wicked man among us is. He comes from a long line of wicked folk. The next minute or two is a blur. Probably because I've tried to block it out. But like most everything I've tried in my life, I didn't do it well enough. Please understand, I don't remember laying a finger on Felt. Cross my heart and swear on my children. The way I remember it, I stood back and watched, even tried to reason with Ralph and the others to leave Felt be. I've gone over 1,000 times in my head, maybe 100,000, and I still don't remember myself as a murderer. But maybe the mind is more powerful than the soul, able to change memories as are too horrible to recall. Because I do remember my knuckles stained in blood, half mine and half his. I remember looking at that flat as a washboard face, the punches of a dozen men having removed any evidence of Felt's high cheekbones and pointy nose. I remember how he looked white as marble in the moonlight. I remember his screams, his, "Why? Why?" and "Fellas! Stop! Fellas!" And I remember when words were replaced by pitiful gargles. Much worse than the creature. It's that memory which haunts me. I can forget it most days, but I remember every night. Whiskey helps, a little, and that's how you know if the old-timer telling you the story was actually there. That's how you can be sure. Before we tossed the body down the hole, we nodded to each other in a silent pact not to tell a soul what happened. We weren't even supposed to talk about it with each other. That was the unspoken vow. So, if somebody knows about Felt, they were there, no mistake. I've often wondered if I could have stopped it. I knew it was strong and I remember protesting some. I had the dagger, and I knew it didn't care for loud sounds. Could be if I was braver I could have used the knife and the knowledge to fight the monster off. But if I stood in the way of the mob, would they have killed us both? Nah. However you cut it, I was a coward. Am a coward. I would have buckled for sure. I just wish Sang hadn't left for help. He wouldn't have let it happen. Rashi was a good man. Made good on his word too. But the guns proved unnecessary. The rescue party never came across the creature, coming straight back to the crag and digging us out. I'm guessing the monster left when it felt so many people miling around above. But it wasn't in the mine. When the townsfolk went back in to recover what little was left of the corpses, most of the survivors skipped town, moving with barely a goodbye to the friends and relatives they grew up with. One came back eventually, but the rest I never saw again. It was just as well. With the biggest mine shut down, there was less work. The owner of the mines talked about reopening a time or two, clearing the rubble. Most of the workers threatened to strike if he did. I'd switched trades by then. Spent the next 20 years in lumber, but the mine's still buried. Way I hear it, kids go up there sometimes, to the collapsed mine. See who's brave enough to hike in and touch the big cursed rock pile. Parents say it's dangerous. Cave-ins and rattlers and such. Grandparents say it's dangerous too, but for different reasons. It's still out there somewhere. Maybe it's found another cavern to call home. Or maybe it never much liked being underground and lives in some forest. Before we came along, my guess is it was trapped, and we loosened it upon the world. Guess I'll never know. Not sure that I'd want to. I'll be dead soon, in a box or an urn. Maybe Rashi had the right of it. Buried things have a tendency not to stay buried. I'd have myself burned too, if it wouldn't cause an uproar at the church. Funny, why should I care? Probably stepped inside that building less than 100 times, and those just for weddings, funerals, and Easter Sundays. There'd be a scandal all the same. I never made much trouble alive. I figure no use in starting after I die. Telling you the story, the whole story, even the worst bits, is my kind of penance. People should know what's out there in the dark, as much as they should know what we did. On Judgment Day, when I have to look felt in the eye and make account of how I've lived, things I've done, at least I can say I told it like it happened. Not until the end, of course. I guess I kept quiet about my sins during the golden years. So if the good judge sees fit to damn me, well, I guess I can't protest all too much. Maybe, in whatever hell I'm heading for, I'll meet the creature again. I was 9 years old when Libby Powell was taken from her bedroom in the middle of the night. Her family lived across the street from us. That night, I was peering through the telescope my father had bought me a few weeks prior to stare at the night sky. Light pollution from the city made it hard to see the stars with the naked eye, but after 3 weeks of peering through the eyepiece, I had found a few constellations that were marked in the star chart that had come with the gift. I looked up from the eyepiece for a half a second and noticed a dark figure moving toward the side of Libby's house. It looked like an impossibly large man crawling all fours. I couldn't make out any features, but I watched as he reached his massive arm through her window and effortlessly punched through the glass and pulled her out in one fluid motion. Libby was kicking and screaming as I let out a shriek and shouted for my father. It was hard to make out what the man was doing as he pulled Libby into the darkness beside the house, but I could almost swear he was looking right at me. My father came into my room, and after calming me down enough to get a coherent answer, he called the police. I told the police everything I just told you. My father and the local authorities treated my statement as being the wild imagination of a scared child, but I know what I saw. For the next week, Libby's parents were all over the news asking for the return of their daughter. The media uproar only intensified a week later when Alice Evans was abducted from her bedroom in a similar manner. In the winter of 1991, 7 young girls were abducted from their bedrooms in my neighborhood. I wasn't the only person that reported the impossibly large man, but if anyone had actually bothered to listen to these reports, they weren't being covered by the local news. By March of 1991, the police had announced they had found all 7 bodies in the nearby abandoned Head Start building on Ingram Street. No suspects had been identified. It wasn't long before the rumors started up on the playground at school. All 7 girls had been so mangled, the families were forced into closed casket funerals. My little brother Alan was especially scared. Alice Evans was his girlfriend. They had met in kindergarten and were one of the couples of young children that held hands everywhere they went. When it was confirmed that Alice was dead, he stopped talking. It was a tragedy that turned into a cold case, that turned into the trial of the decade when the police had come forward to announce they had arrested William Billy Stout for the murder of all 7 girls. All of the neighborhood kids knew Billy Stout. Billy was born with homocystinuria. Despite being more than 7 feet tall and nearly 20 years old, Billy had the mind of a child. It wasn't uncommon for his parents to bring him to the playground later in the day when most of the younger kids had run home for the day. It was revealed during the trial that one of Billy's shirts and a pair of his shoes had blood on them matching Libby's blood type. DNA testing wasn't really a thing back then. With his connection to Libby's death and the reports of an impossibly large suspect, it wasn't long before a guilty returned a guilty verdict and sentenced Billy to death. I knew Billy. I had even traded baseball cards with him on more than one occasion. I know what Billy looked like. When I started telling people that I had seen the guy who grabbed Libby and that he was much larger than Billy, I was either ignored or told that I was telling tall tales. In the spring of 1994, my dad moved us to a house about a mile away from our old neighborhood. Alan had to withdraw from school. Not only had he stopped talking, but he had also started lashing out at anyone who tried to talk to him. The head shrinkers up at the hospital had put him on a series of pills that left him staring out the windows most days. Dad had to hire a full-time caretaker for Alan. 3 years after Libby's abduction and Billy's trial, I was still convinced that there was some giant monster out there stealing kids. I had probably read every book in the local library on ghosts, monsters, and serial killers. I was in 7th grade and most of the kids had started calling me Spooky. Despite being the weird kid, everyone thought I was a devil worshipper or some sort of freak. I had made a few friends. Stephanie Powell shared my opinion on Billy Stout. She had been in the room when her twin sister was snatched from the window. She had a sketchbook filled with drawings of the dark figure that had taken her other half. She and I started spending time with each other in 5th grade, and by junior high, we were pretty much best friends. She introduced me to Deont Jackson. Deont had lost his little sister as well. The three of us ate near the back of the cafeteria. We spent most of our time after school at the library. Deont and I lived a few blocks from each other. Stephanie still lived across the street from my old house. Each day, at around 6 or 7 in the evening, Deont and I would walk Stephanie home before walking the mile or so to my new neighborhood. It was somewhere around early May when he stopped in the middle of the sidewalk and said, "Hey, Spooky, look!" He was pointing at a small patch of trees and brush to the side of a house on the corner. At first, I couldn't make out what he was pointing at. The sun was already low in the sky, and behind us. Deont pointed at the patch of trees, and just as he darted past me, I caught sight of the shadowy figure standing just inside a small wooded area. It must have been 10 feet tall. As Deont ran past me, the dark figure dropped down onto all fours and ran across the street into an alley. I followed him as he chased the shadowy man through the dark alley. He must have walked down that street a few hundred times and never noticed that alley before. It was long and narrow. There were chain-link fences and garages on either side of us as we dodged trash cans and tried to catch up with something that had already disappeared into darkness. We were quickly approaching at the end of the narrow path. At the end of the alley was a near monolithic stone wall. It must have been 20 feet tall. On either side was a similar stone wall that stood nearly as tall, stretching nearly 40 feet back. As we stood in the alley, barely wide enough for a small car, we turned around to see an impossibly large man standing between us and the last bit of the sun dropping below the horizon. The contrast of the orange-red sun against his near pitch-black skin showed exactly how large he was. His eyes were a deep blue, and his mouth had opened to show near-perfect white teeth that looked as if they had been sharpened into tiny daggers. Deont and I realized very quickly that this thing wasn't running from us. It was baiting us into following it. Each step it took toward us was slow and deliberate. Our backs were against the wall. The dark man lowered his face to the point that he was staring directly into my eyes. His tongue extended, and I started crying as he licked my cheek. His expression turned to one of frustration before he turned toward Deont and sniffed his chest. The creature recoiled, seemingly in disgust before planting one foot on the concrete wall to my left, and proceeded to climb over the concrete wall and into the darkness behind it. We didn't wait to see if it would return. The two of us ran out of the alley and back to my house without looking back once. My dad was working late and Becky, Alan's caretaker, had been nice enough to hand us a couple of sodas from the fridge as we spent the rest of the evening trying to make sense of what we had seen while taking turns talking to Stephanie on the phone. By the time my dad had come home, Deont and I had passed out on the floor of the living room. On Saturday morning, the three of us waited until the sun was high in the sky before making our way to that alley. Unbeknownst to the other two, I had taken a small pistol and an extra magazine from my father's gun cabinet. We turned into the alley, to the right of the patch of trees, and quickly came to realize that it led out into the street onto the other side of the block. We walked up and down the alley 3 or 4 times before scouring the rest of the neighborhood looking to see if we could find anything like the stone hallway the dark man had cornered us in. Nothing. Unable to return to the end of the alley, we turned our attention to the small patch of trees where we had originally seen the creature. Just past the tree line, we found a raised mound of dirt that seemed to be hiding a 5.5-foot wide hole in the ground. I wasn't about to climb down into it, and I don't think either of the others were so inclined. Instead, I threw a rock into the hole. I heard it bounce off the sides a few times, before making a sound like it had plopped into a pool of water. Deont said, "Avert your eyes, Steph. This thing took Andrea and I'm gonna piss on it. Stephanie turned away as he proceeded to take a leak directly into the mouth of the hole. Just like with the rock, heard the piss hitting what sounded like water at the bottom. However, no sooner than Dion had zipped his pants, we heard a bellowing roar come from somewhere deep in the chasm, followed by loud scraping sounds. We bolted, and just as we cleared the edge of the trees, I looked back to see a pitch-black arm with a massive black hand swipe in our general direction. We had found its lair. You'd think that we'd have found a way to plug the hole or convince some adults to do something about it. But 3 years of trying to convince people that the Dark Man existed in the first place had taught us that no one was going to believe us. Instead of trying our hardest, we went back to the library and spent the rest of the day looking for anything we could find that would tell us more about the Dark Man. I spent most of the afternoon in the paranormal section of the adult library. I sat at a table flipping through books on ghosts, cryptids, and various local legends. Dion and Stephanie had disappeared at some point and left me to my reading. I had become used to the idea that they had probably slipped into a reading room or something to make out. They had been dating for a few months at that point. The librarian walked up to my table and said, "Francis, we're going to be closing up in a few. You might want to head home." The library closed early on Saturday. I stepped outside to see Dion and Stephanie sitting snuggled up next to each other on the bench listening to Stephanie's Walkman and sharing the headphones. It was 6 in the afternoon and the sun was still fairly high in the sky, but we were more than 2 miles from home and the bus had stopped running a few minutes prior. I had an uneasy feeling about walking home. I turned to Stephanie and said, "Do you think we could call your parents to come pick us up?" Stephanie shook her head before saying, "My dad hates Dion. I'd just as soon call the police and told him I stole something." Dion laughed and said, "Yeah, dude hates me, but we can call my cousin Q." We walked to a nearby payphone, and I dropped a quarter in the slot as Dion picked up the receiver and called Q. A few minutes later, a teenager in a station wagon pulled up and said, "Yo, Dion, who's the chick?" Dion punched me in the arm and said, "Oh, you mean Spooky here?" "Nah, he's a guy, I think." Q laughed and said, "Stop clowning, dude. Now, where am I taking y'all?" I climbed into the front seat with Q and Dion climbed into the back with Stephanie. Q was Dion's older cousin. He lived with Dion and their grandmother not too far from my place. I reached into my bag to pull out my water bottle and Q tapped me on the shoulder whispering, "Yo kid, why are you packing heat?" I looked down in the bag and saw that the pistol was in plain view. I turned to Q and said, "Man, you don't want to know." We pulled into Q's driveway, and he turned around to say, "D, go introduce Gramps to your girl. I'm gonna talk with Spooky for a minute." "Alright, little man, why are you running around with that pistol?" Q asked in a concerned tone. I stared out the window and replied, "Do you know why they call me Spooky?" Q replied, "Yeah, because you're always going about ghosts and shit." I laughed uncomfortably and said, "No, it's because I watched the thing that stole Dee's sister grab Libby Powell. It wasn't Billy Stout." Q's tone changed to one of anger and he raised his voice slightly and said, "Don't be putting any of that ghost story shit on Andrea. I hope that fucking retard burns in hell for what he did." I turned to Q and stared directly into his eyes and said, "The thing looks like a man, but his skin is as black as midnight, and he stands almost 10 feet tall. You think I'm fucking around? Ask Dion. He saw it too." Q visibly shuddered and said, "I can see why they call you Spooky." I continued, "We know where that thing is, and as soon as I see it again, I'm gonna shoot it. Don't tell D or Steph either. They don't know about my dad's gun, and I'm not telling them." Q pulled a cigarette from a pack in his shirt pocket and offered it to me, saying, "You smoke?" I lied and said, "Sure." He lit the cigarette and handed it to me before lighting one for himself. 13 years of living with an indoor smoker, and I didn't even cough when I first inhaled the cool methanol of the cigarette. By the second drag, I was already feeling kinda dizzy, but I liked it. I smoked the cigarette and stared out the windshield in silence as Q and I shared that moment. After nearly 5 minutes of silence, Q said, "You should talk to my Grams about that tall dark dude. Sounds like a story she used to tell us. I got out of the car and went inside to see that Dion's grandmother had already set out a feast for us. Stephanie and Grams were chatting with each other about Dion as Q came in behind me. Grams said, "I can smell that smoke on you, Quentin Marcus Jackson. You better wash your hands before you touch this food." I joined him at the sink and washed my hands as well. I didn't want to risk getting on her bad side. Q pulled up a chair and Dion said grace as we all sat around the table. Stephanie had called her parents saying she was at my house. My dad probably wouldn't be home in time to notice I had stayed out late. We ate and talked over dinner until Grams told Q to take Stephanie home and sent Dion upstairs to shower and get ready for bed. I helped her clear the table as she said, "So, what were you and Q talking about outside? He looked like he had seen a ghost." I didn't answer. Grams put the last dish from the table up on the counter before saying, "Y'all shouldn't be running around this town at night. It's dangerous out there." I laughed and said, "You have no idea." Grams got a look on her face that was halfway between stern and afraid when she said, "Try me, kid." For the next hour, I told her about Libby, the dark man, the end of the alley that wasn't really there, and how we had found a hole it seemed to be hiding in. Grams didn't say much, but she also wasn't telling me I was crazy or making things up. It was nice to have an adult that was actually listening to me for once. As Grams sat there and listened, Dion came downstairs in his pajamas and posted up next to his grandmother. She turned to her grandson and said, "So y'all ran into him, huh?" Dion nodded and Grams reached into her purse and pulled out a small metal flask. After taking a swig, she coughed and said, "Y'all need to listen close. It might save your life. When I was about Q's age, everyone was upset about Russians dropping atom bombs. The folks up in the city council got the idea that they were going to build a tunnel that connected a bunch of fallout shelters under the city. That old Head Start building used to be an elementary school. One of the shelters was built right there in the basement. My husband Percy worked on the digging crew. He'd come home telling me stories about how they had tunneled from the elementary school all the way to the train depot over on the 3rd Avenue. Then one day, people stopped worrying about bombs and the city stopped working on the tunnel. Percy got a job with the city working on the roads. The shelters were still there. The tunnel was still open. People just didn't much care for it anymore. That is, of course, until they found all the bodies." Grams paused for a moment and continued. "We had been telling the police for weeks that someone had been going around snatching up our kids. But back then, no one really cared what happened to a bunch of colored children. It was only when the mayor's daughter went missing that the police started looking into it. 3 more white kids went missing in a week, and one of the mothers described a tall black man running off into the elementary school. The police searched every inch of that building, and when they found nothing, they went down into the basement and found the door to the tunnel standing wide open. Less than an hour later, they were calling in every available officer. They had found 15 kids torn to shreds in the fallout shelter. Some of them looked like they had been there for months. One of them, the last girl to be taken, was still breathing when they found her. She pointed into the tunnel and let out a little whimper of a scream before passing away right then and there." Grams took another swig of her flask and coughed again before she adjusted herself in her seat and leaned forward. "The police didn't waste any time rounding up every tall black man in the city looking for someone to pin the murders on. They eventually settled on Alton Park. Alton was kinda slow, but he was also the janitor at the school. His trial lasted less than a day and he was sentenced to hang. He was dead within the week. Beatrice Stone outside the courthouse screaming to anyone who would listen about how Alton was innocent. She screamed that he wasn't tall enough and how the man who took her daughter had skin as black as pitch. Not brown like me or Q. She spent the next few years in a sanitarium before her family finally brought her home. I think she's still up in Springhaven nursing home to this day. She doesn't talk anymore. People say she just sits there and stares at the window. I was more than a little stunned by her story, but something wasn't sitting right with me. I paused for a moment after she finished and said, "How is this gonna save our lives?" Graham sighed and said, "I was getting to that, son." I gripped my backpack a little tighter as she said, "About 10 years later, some kids went missing. Once again, they were found in that elementary school. Once again, they pinned it on someone slow. We knew the cops weren't gonna help us, so when it came time for the winter about 10 years later, we all took shifts watching our kids. Q's mother was around 5 or 6 back then. Percy was sitting in the bedroom with our oldest son James taking turns staring out the window and holding the shotgun. Mabel, Q's mother, and her brother Ozzy were in bed when the creature came. Percy said it almost looked like a shadow at first. Jesse was holding the shotgun and fired directly into its chest. It let out a blood-curdling howl. Jesse and Mabel screamed and went to the floor. The creature reached in and grabbed James by the arm and threw him into the wall hard enough to knock him out cold. Percy went for the gun and was already bringing it up when I reached in and grabbed Jesse. Mabel was sitting there on the floor when that damned thing poked its head down and sniffed her before turning and looking at Jesse. He reached for him just in time for Percy to reload the shotgun and fire a spray of buckshot directly into the thing's face. It howled as it jumped out of the window and into the night. Grams took the flask and passed it to Dion, saying, "Drink up, son. You too, Francis." Dion took a swig and gagged before passing it to me. I took a sip and felt it burning as it slid down my throat. Grams took her flask back and said, "Jesse was the sweetest little boy you'd ever met. Mabel was a little troublemaker, though. After talking to Ethel Pearson at church, we heard how her twin girls were sleeping in the same bed when it took one and left the other. She cursed under her breath and said that she watched it look away from the surviving girl in disgust. Apparently, the leftover girl had just been caught stealing from her mother's purse that day." Dion interrupted and said, "It only takes the good kids, right?" Grams patted Dion on the head and said, "That's my smart boy. Now, don't go and set a church on fire or anything, but make sure you do at least one thing every day that would get you in trouble if you get caught." I skipped church the next day and walked up to Springhaven. After showing the nurse at the front desk my Bible and claiming that I'd come up to minister to the elderly, she let me in with a smile. Grams had said the woman's name was Beatrice Stone. I walked the hallways for a bit, stopping in a few rooms to talk about Jesus, so as not to raise any suspicion before seeing the name B. Stone outside of a room and finding an elderly woman sitting in a chair staring out the window. I sat down next to her and opened my Bible and saying, "Mrs. Stone, my name is Francis Colley." She didn't so much as blink in response. I continued, "I know this is gonna sound strange, but I have a question for you about the thing that took your daughter." Her face shifted to a stern expression and her eyes shot toward my direction while her face remained in the general direction of the window. "Did it have blue eyes?" I said as I realized I was being more than a little inconsiderate for perhaps the first time that morning. Beatrice coughed and said in a quiet voice, "His teeth were like knives." She turned to me and said, "How did you get close enough to see it, boy?" I told her about the alley and how it had licked me. She grabbed me by the wrist and said, "Why do you get to live when my baby died? What makes you so special?" I didn't have an answer for her beyond what Grams had said the night before. I stammered out the words, "It only takes the good kids." The elderly woman jumped from her chair and pummeled me with a quickness I had not expected from a woman pushing 80. I screamed in pain as she raked her nails across my face. As the orderlies were pulling me off her, she screamed, "If it won't kill you, I will!" I had to call my dad up to the nursing home and fed him a line about how I was evangelizing to the sick and elderly when the woman attacked me. I showed up at school the next day with stitches on my forehead and cheek. Dion asked what happened and I lied about saying I got into a fight with a high schooler. He laughed and said, "Yeah, and last night I plowed Cindy Crawford." We both laughed and went to class. Stephanie was waiting for us outside after the bell rang at 3. When the school bus pulled onto my street, there were police cars everywhere. We all stepped off a bit early, as the bus backed off my street and took an alternate route. The closer I got to my house, the more I started to feel the sickness in the pit of my stomach. My worst fears were realized when I saw that the window to Alan's room had been obliterated. Becky, the caretaker, sat on the back of an ambulance as paramedics bandaged her hands and face. My father was shouting at the police only to stop mid-sentence and run over to me. He picked me up into the kind of hug I hadn't experienced since kindergarten. He held me and cried as he said, "We're gonna find your brother, okay?" He put me down and I pushed past him into the house. No one seemed all that interested in my room, and I dumped the books out of my backpack before stuffing with road flares, a flashlight, the gun I had stolen from Dad's safe, and some extra batteries. I stormed outside and marched up to the nearest cop saying, "You know damn well my brother is gonna end up in that fucking preschool. Just grab some men and go down there already." The officer shot me an annoyed look and said, "You should watch your language, kid." I looked up at him and said, "Fuck you. If you aren't gonna do anything to save Alan, then I will." He turned back to his colleagues and I started off down the road as Deont and Stephanie followed me asking where I was going. It didn't eat the bad kids. Alan was kicked out of school for beating up other students. It didn't grab him because it was hungry. I knew beyond knowing that it grabbed him to punish us for bothering it. As I approached the abandoned Head Start building, Deont stopped me in my tracks and said, "Damn it, Francis, stop." I stopped and he continued, "What do you think you're gonna do to that thing?" I pulled the gun from my bag and pulled back the slide before saying, "I'm gonna fucking kill it." Deont and Stephanie took a step back before Stephanie said, "Do you have another one of those?" I shook my head and she said, "Well, what do you have?" I passed out the flashlight and a few road flares and we made our way into the abandoned preschool. Most of the glass on the doors had been busted out years before I was born. The city had boarded the place up, but there was a small window that still had glass and that's where we broke in. Once we were inside, the smell hit us immediately. The whole building smelled like raw sewage. Stephanie coughed and said, "We should probably follow the smell." I nodded and in a few minutes, we found a doorway leading down into what looked like a basement. Stephanie turned on the flashlight and I took point as we moved down the stairs. We walked across the basement and toward the open hole in the wall that led to the tunnel. A heavy iron door lay rusted on the ground directly across from us. I could hear a quiet whimpering from inside. We rushed inside and that's when the flashlight caught Alan's leg just above us. The thing had impaled him on a piece of rebar that had been bent down from the crumbling concrete ceiling. Alan whimpered some more as if he hadn't even noticed us. Deont dropped a road flare in the tunnel behind us. It gave off a hiss before giving us a bit more light to work with. Alan was too high up for any of us to pull him down. I turned to Stephanie and said, "Run upstairs and get help." She nodded and turned to go when we saw it. The creature stood in the red light of the flare. It was covered in slimy liquid and had to crouch in the tunnel. It leaned on its long arms and smiled as it stared directly at me. Deont popped another road flare and held it in front of him as I pulled a pistol and proceeded to empty the magazine into its torso. I immediately realized my mistake. None of us had brought earplugs and the deafening sound of the gunshots left us disoriented and unable to hear each other. The creature shook off the bullets and grabbed Stephanie by the face with its massive hand. Before I could load the next magazine into the gun, I was hit by the creature as it used Stephanie as a flail and knocked me to the ground. Deont pushed the flare into creature's arm, and it recoiled in pain before closing its hand into a fist and punching him so hard that his head looked like it had been crushed with a sledgehammer. With one friend dead at my feet, and another being used as a weapon to pummel me into the ground, I had all but resigned myself to the fact that I was gonna die. As I laid there broken, the creature laughed and said, "There's no such thing as heroes, kid," in a voice that sounded like someone was playing a recording of James Earl Jones through a speaker made of gravel. It held on to Stephanie as it moved deeper into the tunnel, laughing the whole time. I couldn't move. My arms and legs were useless. Slowly but surely, the road flare burned out. I lay there watching Alan whimper until the flashlight started to dim. As the last of the light left the crumbling fallout shelter, I noticed that my little brother had gone completely still, Left alone in the darkness, I eventually passed out. My father says that the police found me and Alan after about a day of searching. I woke up in the hospital in a full body cast. They never found Stephanie. Dion's body was laid to rest a few days later. I wasn't able to make it to the funeral. It wasn't long before the city filled the tunnel with concrete. I have no idea if the Dark Man was inside, but given that kids still go missing in that town every 10 or so years, I'm gonna assume it found a new place to set up shop. After I was well enough to walk on my own, my dad took a job in a neighboring state and we moved. I'm pushing 40 these days, and I have a few kids of my own. It might sound strange, but as soon as they were old enough to know the difference between right and wrong, I encouraged them to do bad things every now and then. It might not make me the best parent in the world, but then again, nothing has ever tried to snatch them up. It only eats the good kids, but it has no problem killing the bad ones. I still have no idea why it left me alive. The Yukon's a cold and unforgiving land, littered mostly by sprawling forests and rolling plains. Nature is queen out here, and she rules this land with a graceful iron fist. Those who test her rarely live to tell their tales, and I'm afraid that proverb is becoming truer by the day. For the better part of the last decade, I have been a park ranger at Tombstone Territorial Park. It's a massive nature reserve sprawling over 2,100 square kilometers. The land boasts a wide array of environments with thick forests, rolling fields, icy lakes, glaciers, and geysers which allow for some magnificent views and unique experiences. It's truly beautiful, breathtaking, and I don't think I'd trade it for anything else. However, something truly bizarre is going on out here, and I've been forced to rethink everything. I've never been much of a writer myself, so forgive me if the parts of this are not the most vernacularly pleasing. Truth is, I figured I had to write it, because the media sure as hell ain't gonna cover it. What's happening out here is something I believe everyone deserves to know. It started about 2 weeks ago, when a late-night visitor caught me and a fellow ranger, Gunny, just as we were about to head out for the evening. We use call signs for all the rangers out here, so I'll just refer to them by that to protect their real identities. Gunny and I had just locked up the main office cabin, when the sounds of a screeching engine emerged in the distance. A second or two later, and we see headlights emerge down the trail. It was a Ski-Doo, and it was coming up fast. Within moments, he was nearing our cabin. I almost thought the person wasn't going to stop at all, when he suddenly squeezed the handbrake and caused the vehicle to skid several yards and come to a stop underneath one of the exterior floodlights. His orange pleated jacket was torn up, and helmet cracked. He killed the engine and I saw his wide eyes beneath his visor. He then basically flopped off the vehicle, hitting the ground with a thud before jumping back to his feet. He tore the helmet from his head using just his right arm, while his left dangled freely at his side as if it was injured. The man met our confused stare with a wide-eyed, clearly frantic stare. In a muttering, frantic tone, he managed to convey to us what had happened. He said he and his buddy were on a hunting trip, and they'd been out there for 3 days. He said they were attacked in their camp, and his friend was badly injured, and might already be dead. We tried calming him down, and asking him what had happened, but the man just kept shaking his head and begging us to save his friend. We ushered him inside, and 2 of the other rangers began tending to his injuries, as Gunny and I mounted up. We grabbed our rifles from the lodge, and got on our ski-doos to go find the wounded hunter's friend. The area the man had indicated was a solid 20-minute ride out, just outside the park's recreational trails in a well-known area which was popular with hunters. Gunny and I took off riding, feeling the cold air dig into our splotches of exposed skin like little needles. We were never able to get a description from the man of what it was that attacked him. I imagined it was a bear, pack of wolves, or moose, which are all fairly common out here. Attacks from wildlife are relatively rare out here, but they do happen. Something about the event had left a deep pit of dread in my stomach though, and it persisted throughout the entire ride out to the location. Several minutes later, Gunny rounded a corner ahead of me and slowed. I followed behind, and the headlights from my rig shone on a campsite off to the right side of the trail. He and I parked, and I saw the remnants of a tent swaying gently in the breeze. Debris was littered all over the camp, and most of their gear had been smashed or torn to shreds. It looked like a combination of a tornado, and Freddy Krueger had ransacked the site. Gunny and I cradled our rifles as we searched the camp. The night was eerily silent, filled only by random gusts of wind that rustled the trees. After only a minute or two, we found the missing man, and he was not nearly as lucky as his partner. He was sprawled out in the remnants of his tent, face pale and body covered in blood. His chest had been absolutely gutted, leaving fragments of internal organs scattered throughout the area. I felt bile rise in my throat as I observed the morbid scene, and turned away to dry heave as Gunny got a closer look. I've seen my fair share of animal attacks and accidental deaths out here, but I've never seen something quite that extreme. Something had completely eviscerated the guy. Suddenly, I heard the crackling of branches coming from the tree line on the other side of the trail. I lifted my rifle and aimed towards it, shouting a command for whoever was there to show themselves. Part of me anticipated a person stepping out of the woods, but what actually emerged was far more curious. A quadruped silhouette rose in the woods, sporting a decent set of antlers. It stepped out, revealing itself as a 3-point juvenile deer, probably just a few years old. Normally deer are rather skittish, but not this one. It just stared at me, and my heart lurched into my throat. Its antlers were bloodied, covered in strands of flesh and viscera, and its eyes appearing as obsidian pools devoid of tint. Gunny stepped beside me, both of us clutching our rifles at our chest. Time seemed to stand still then, as the three of us maintained that silent staring contest for several uncomfortable seconds. Then, without warning, it charged. Gunny and I fired multiple times, but the deer trudged onward, slamming into Gunny and knocking him back several feet. He fell on the ground with a groan, and the deer swiveled in my direction. I fired another round which struck square in its torso. The deer wobbled on its feet for a moment as the .308 bullet tore through its heart, causing blood to spurt from inside and stain the snow. It collapsed in a heap a moment later. I rushed to Gunny and helped him to his feet. He had been gored in the shoulder, and was bleeding, but thankfully, it was mostly a glancing blow. The two of us stared down bewildered at the apparently bloodthirsty deer. It was the weirdest thing I'd ever seen. Normally, the only time deer becomes aggressive like that is when they're cornered, which this one clearly wasn't. Not only had it killed a poor other hunter, but it had struck around and tried attacking us as well. It was very unusual behavior for a deer, to put it mildly. Gunny then pointed out its eyes, and the mystery grew deeper. Its eyes were entirely black, like little pools of obsidian. Normally, deer's eyes are pretty dark anyways, with amber or dark brown irises. Gunny shined a light on them, and we saw no trace of that whatsoever. We thought then that maybe the deer was sick, rabies or some other disease. Gunny joked that maybe it was the start of a zombie apocalypse, but I didn't find it as funny as he did. With that notion in mind, the two of us fled, because if the creature was rabid, then Gunny needed medical assistance ASAP. We sped back to camp, and found EMTs on the scene as well as a police car when we got there. The other man was unconscious and strapped onto the gurney in the back of the ambulance. One of the EMTs began tending to Gunny, but luckily, it didn't appear as though he'd been too badly injured. Rabies is spread normally through bodily fluid, and since Gunny had been struck by its antlers, contraction of the disease seemed unlikely. Regardless, Gunny loaded into the ambulance as well, and the team drove off soon after. I stayed behind, and the sheriff shot me a peculiar glance. Buddy said his friend was still out there. You guys find him? I nodded, and swallowed as I tried to devise a way to explain what we'd seen. The sheriff's eyes grew wide as I explained what we had witnessed. And you're sure it was a deer? I nodded, both of us confused. The sheriff shot a forlorn glance into the distance, and seemed to ponder the implications for a moment. You ever heard of anything like that happening? I asked, and he scoffed. Not unless it was cornered or rabid. That is some seriously strange behavior. He met my stare once more. And you're sure the guy was dead? I nodded again, and there was no doubt in my mind. The sheriff pondered the situation for a moment, and then sighed. Well, we better go find him before the critters do. The trail was too narrow to drive the trucks down, so we loaned the sheriff and his 3 officers our ski-doos to go have a look. Gunny was whisked away to the hospital, and I stayed behind to wait for the sheriff. It was well past midnight when headlights finally emerged on the trail. I exited the cabin and met with the sheriff and his team. All of them appeared exhausted and wore confused grimaces on their faces. The sheriff, too, looked perplexed. "You guys find the camp?" I asked. The sheriff nodded, but his confusion didn't diminish. "We found it, but there ain't nobody out there. Ain't no sign of that buck you 2 shot either." That didn't make any sense to me, and I didn't know how to respond. "They weren't breathing." The sheriff nodded and pulled out a smoke from his pocket. He sparked it up and took a deep inhale, allowing the smoke to pour from his gullet and spiral into the breeze. "Something probably dragged them off. I'll get a search team together. But I'll have to wait till morning." He tipped his cap, and he and his team departed. I left soon after, but I think anyone got a good night's sleep. The next morning, the sheriff kept his promise, and by 9 a.m., he had amassed a search team consisting of 5 cops, 6 rangers including myself, and about 24 volunteers from the town. The sheriff gave us all the rundown on the situation, and soon after, we entered the woods, scouring in grid formation. We did that until the sun went down, and never found anything. Just snowy vistas and silent woods with no trace of the hunter on the buck. Some of the search team, especially the guy's family, held out hope that he was still alive and just lost. I didn't have the heart to tell them the truth that he had no pulse, but I found no way of explaining how the corpses had just vanished from their camp. There are cougars, bears, wolves, and a few other smaller carnivores and scavengers in these woods, but none of them typically drag their food away, at least not too far. We searched their camp top to bottom, and found a trail in the snow where the unfortunate hunter had been dragged off. Something had dragged his body through the snow for about 50 meters, but the trail was a dead end. It just ended, with several set of animal tracks carrying on further into the woods but no trace of the corpse. Some of the footprints even appeared human, but we aren't able to confirm that. Nevertheless, that brought forth 2 very concerning possibilities. Either this was foul play and someone else was out there that carried off the body, or the body carried off itself. The former explanation was the main theory, as the latter was obviously ridiculous. I have been on dozens of search and rescue missions out here, and it happens several times a year. Usually the person is found without incident, but every once in a while, we do find a corpse. What is really strange is when you never find anything at all. We returned to camp as the night began to swallow the trees, feeling disheartened and exhausted. The missing hunter's family was obviously devastated by the lack of progress, as were the rest of us. The odds of anyone surviving these sub-zero woods for over 24 hours are slim, especially if they're injured. The sheriff took a head count when we got back, and before he even finished, I realized we were missing someone. One of the senior rangers who goes by Eagle was not accounted for. I tried radioing him, but got no response. Myself and 3 other rangers, Mazda, Penguin, and Whiskey, set off to locate him, already fearing the worst. Eagle is an expert on these woods if there ever was one, and he's been out here for over 3 decades. He basically wrote the handbook on search team etiquette and procedure, and leaving the group alone is probably number 1 on the list of things not to do. The woods were silent then, appearing much more sinister than they had when the light illuminated them. The gnarled, leafless trees seemed to reach out for us with skeleton fingers. The hair stood on the back of my neck, and froze every time a slight breeze rolled through. A sudden shout from behind caused me to turn back, and gawk at an unusual sight. Mazda was on the ground rolling back and forth as something small appeared to be attacking him. "Get it off! Get it off!" Penguin rushed to Mazda's aid, and grabbed hold of the creature which had assaulted him. He then tossed it away, revealing it as a squirrel which quickly darted back into the woods. Mazda's coat was torn, but he wasn't hurt thankfully. Penguin helped him up, and he tried catching his breath. "You steal his acorns or something?" Whiskey asked with a chuckle, but Mazda was clearly rattled. Needless to say, squirrel attacks are not exactly common here, or anywhere as far as I know. "The hell's going on over here?" A fifth voice then called from the left, and out stepped Eagle with a confused expression. "Where you been? We were looking for you. Why'd you break off?" I questioned him, somewhat annoyed by his neglect. "Sorry, I thought I heard something." He didn't say any more, and just walked right by me to head back to camp. The other rangers followed him, but something made me pause. Silence. The type of silence only found in a cold winter's night. It's something I know quite well, but that night was different, and I stared out into the dark, murky trees. I could have sworn something was staring back. We all rendezvoused back at the cabin, and the sheriff stood in the center to speak. He basically just thanked everyone for coming out, and that the search would resume the following day. I gave Gunny a call on my ride home, and he seemed to be doing well. Probably from the plethora of pain meds that were apparent in his slurred, unusually chipper tone. I told him we still hadn't found either of those corpses and that Mazda had been attacked by a squirrel. After he finally stopped laughing about that, he said something I found interesting. "Damn, first the buck, now squirrels are attacking people? Someone must have really pissed off Mother Nature." Thankfully, his rabies test came back negative, and just needed some time for the stitches to heal. He and I shared a few jokes, and I playfully told him to rest up so he could hurry back and gather firewood for the cabin. I didn't sleep well that night, and didn't manage it at all until about 1 a.m. When I finally did fall asleep, I didn't get much rest. I don't remember the details, but I had some very intense dreams. I hesitate to use the word nightmare, because it's kind of cliché to me, but I think that's the best word to describe it. Like I said, I don't remember the details, only me waking up with a frantic gasp and drenched in a cold sweat. It might have been just the stress of everything weighing on my subconscious, but the anxiety refused to subside. Since sleep didn't like an activity I was going to experience that night, I decided to just wake up early and head into work. I figured I could get a head start on everyone, and hopefully find the missing hunter. It didn't really seem likely by that point, and as my headlights beamed into the parking lot of the cabin, I found I wasn't even the first one there that day. Eagle's beat-up Ford F-150 sat in the lot gathering snow. I pulled up beside it, and stepped out into the frigid morning, shivering as a cold gust caressed the back of my neck. Eagle wasn't in his truck, so I figured he must already be inside. I had hoped he had the courtesy of putting on a fresh cup of coffee, but the cabin was still locked and unlit. After unlocking it, I stepped inside and called out for him, but got no response. I then begrudgingly took on the duty of making coffee myself, since without it, I'm about as useful as a pair of lead underwear. As it began to slimmer, I took a more extensive look around the cabin. I thought maybe Eagle had just fallen asleep in one of the offices, but I didn't find him anywhere. On a hunch, I checked the key cabinet, and my heart sunk. One of the sets of keys was missing. After checking the shed, I realized its counterpart Ski-Doo was also gone. I stared out down the trail, but heard and saw no sign of Eagle on the Ski-Doo. I couldn't imagine what possessed him to go out there alone, and it really left me in an uncomfortable spot. All I wanted was to sip my coffee and wait for the others, but I knew I had to go find him. With an annoyed sigh, I washed out a thermos from the cupboard, filled it to the brim with coffee, and snagged another one of the keys. I fired the Ski-Doo up, burnt the shit out of my lips taking a sip of coffee, and hit the throttle. In just a few seconds, I was on the trail out to the hunting grounds, as it was the only place I could figure that Eagle would have gone. It's winter here now, and the sun doesn't rise until well past 9. It was around 6 then, but the darkness still reigned supreme, with my only defense against it being the headlights on the Ski-Doo. Several minutes later, and I was about halfway to the search area, when I saw something off to the left. The missing Ski-Doo sat alone by the edge of a small gully. I pulled up alongside it and killed the engine. Once more, the deafening silence consumed the environment. The Ski-Doo was covered in a thin layer of snow, so it must have been out there a decent amount of time. For all I know, Eagle may never have even left the night before. I thought about calling out for him, but I didn't. That same unspoken, haunting feeling was permeating the environment. It felt like breaking the silence was a sin in and of itself. I'll be honest, everything in me was screaming to turn tail and run back to the cabin, but I couldn't just abandon Eagle. He could have been injured, and my conscience wouldn't let me leave. The snow crunched underneath my boots, sounding like shattering glass in contrast to the still night. I made it to the edge of the woods, and tried peering inside, but the canopy of trees refused to relent their secrets. Something then snapped in the woods, a twig or branch. It was a significant distance away, but might as well have been a gunshot with how distinct it was. It's well known that bears and humans are the only creatures clumsy enough to snap twigs. I looked around, once again considering calling out, but didn't. Another snap, this time to the left in the trees ahead of me. I tried rationalizing that it had just been snow falling off a branch, but it didn't quell my nerves much. Suddenly, there was a raspy wail, a sound which sent shivers down my spine. It called out again and again with a few second intervals in between. After probably the fifth or sixth one, I recognized it as a fox. Damn things make some creepy-ass noises, especially at night. Sure enough, a lone red fox popped out of the trees some 30 meters behind me. Its eyes locked right on me, and the two of us just stared at one another for a moment. Suddenly, it lifted its head and shrieked again, this time in a completely different tone. It was the weirdest sound, almost like an odd raspy snarl. The fox then darted back into the trees and silence returned. It didn't seem that significant, but suddenly a feeling struck me, on which I doubt I'll ever find the exact words to convey. A series of powerful, almost painful goosebumps jutted forth all over my skin. The hairs on my neck stood erect, and I felt my heart rate soar into my chest. There was a weird scent in the air, like copper and mildew, and it was terrifying. It was like some primal sense within me had reawakened and set off alarm bells and every fear reaction my body had. I turned back down the trail ahead of me. The moon had split the somber clouds above and beamed an effervescent light down upon the glistening alabaster field. At the other end of the field was a blockade of pines, and within them, something stared back at me. It was bipedal, obscured mostly by shadow, tall and gaunt, slender and menacing. It's hard for me to describe it beyond that, and believe me, I've tried. The thing looked almost human, and it was a fair distance away so I couldn't make out its full details. But its impact was immediate, the way my own body reacted. Like I was biologically programmed to fear it is a feeling I just can't get over. Whatever it was, that thing was not human. We just stared at each other for a while, until slowly, its left arm lifted. Its finger uncurled in a pointing motion towards me. I started to back away towards my skidoo, and the fox yelped behind me once more. I fired up the skidoo as the calls of crows and owls reverberated overhead. More animals emerged from the woods. Squirrels, rabbits, deer, fishers, rats, and others. Dozens of forest denizens, all converging on me. I didn't stick around to see what they intended to do, and full throttled the skidoo all the way back to the cabin as the forest came alive behind me. The sheriff and two of his guys were there when I arrived. They turned as I came speeding back into the lot, killing the engine and quickly unmounting. The three of them eyed me in confusion as I tried to catch my breath. The animals! There's something out there! I looked to the sheriff and his confusion seemed to increase. Slow down, son. What are you talking about? Through a mumbled stream of barely coherent gibberish, I finally managed to spit out the most important detail of what I was trying to convey. Eagle's gone! The sheriff's eyes widened, and as if on cue, a familiar yowl peered the night. I turned back and saw the same, or at least a similar-looking fox staring at me from the trail. Its sockets were like two hollowed-out shells, and the eyes within them so dark, it's as if they were molded from the abyss itself. I stepped back, but the others didn't seem to sense my apprehension. The sheriff just eyed the fox warily, and it returned the gesture back at him. More sounds then emerged, chirps, growls, wails, and others one by one. In seconds, they formed into a dizzying chorus. A myriad of woodland creatures began to emerge from the thicket with eyes of pure obsidian and malice. The sheriff took a step back and pulled his pistol from the holster. The other cops did the same, as the blockade of creatures stalked closer and closer. Suddenly, there was a loud grunt, and an enormous shadow came charging through the trees. Its hooves slammed into the ground, kicking dirt and snow aside, while gaining speed as its formidable antlers lowered like a battering ram. It was a bull moose. And before we could even retreat, it was on top of us. The sheriff lifted his pistol and fired several rounds, but it barely fazed the enraged creature. A 9mm against a full-sized moose is little more effective than spitting at it. And in seconds, the beast slammed into the sheriff, launching him several meters back. He slammed into the snow hard, groaning from the impact as the beast scraped its hoof along the ground, snorting. The other cops fired on it, and although the bullets weren't enough to kill it, they did succeed in causing it to retreat for a moment. I scrambled to the sheriff, and he groaned in protest as I tried helping him to his feet. I got him back inside his SUV, and he handed me the keys. As I rounded the front of the vehicle, I saw a shadow leap onto one of the other cops. He screamed as a tomcat dug its claws and fangs into the nape of his neck. The other officer ran to his aid, but he was set upon by a horde of small creatures. Crows swept down pecking at their faces, while rabbits, squirrels, and chipmunks nipped at their ankles. I was about to leave the truck and try to help, when a badger slammed onto the hood of the truck, its voracious fangs and claws slashing at the windshield, trying to reach me. Thuds emerged all around us as countless other animals attacked. There was only one thing I could do then. I hit the gas, and the truck roared into action, flinging chunks of snow out behind us. I saw animals tumble from the hull as we swerved away, the screams of the other cops blaring like sirens in the night. The Badger 2 finally tumbled from the hood as I skidded to the right. "Go back! I'm not leaving them!" the sheriff commanded, though in his broken state, I knew he could do nothing to help. I was conflicted on fleeing or turning back to help, so nature stepped in and made a decision for me. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a familiar silhouette emerge. The moose slammed full force into the passenger side of the vehicle. The window splintered and frame crumpled on impact. The force was so immense that I felt the truck rock on its axles. And before I could react, it teetered over and collapsed on its side. My head slammed hard against the window, and my vision grew fuzzy. In my momentary delirium, I saw the light beginning to grow on the horizon. The miasma of sound swirled into my brain as I heard the other man scream in pain and desperation. A familiar snort then struck, and I saw the bull moose stomp out in front of the broken SUV. I felt its gaze bear down upon me, and its enormous rack poised to tear me to shreds. All of a sudden, there came the soft whistling noise. It was like the sound of a harrowing winter breeze played through a clarinet, strange, piercing, and otherworldly. The moose then lifted its head, as if alerted by the sound. It shot me one final disdainful glance, and then trotted away. I heard the sounds of the other animals fleeing as well, and the pain-stricken groans of the other cops. I looked to my side, and saw the sheriff, suspended in the seat above me. Luckily, one of us had remembered to wear their seatbelt. He was barely conscious and bleeding. I managed to orient myself towards the windshield, and after a series of kicks, I finally managed to kick it out. I crawled from the wreckage of the SUV on wobbly legs, still dazed and in disbelief of what I had just witnessed. One of the cops was standing by the other vehicles, clasping his chest with his right arm. His left arm had been torn clean off, and his face was scraped and scratched to hell. I regrouped with him, and found that as bad as his condition was, he was the lucky one. His fellow officer was laying a few meters away, his chest uttering labored breaths. His face looked like it had just been shoved into a blender, and his torso didn't fare much better. There was nothing we could do for him, and less than a minute later, he stopped breathing. The wounded cop then radioed for backup, as I attempted to rouse the unconscious sheriff. A few minutes later, and a cavalcade of cops, ambulances, and citizen vehicles rolled up on the grisly scene. They got the sheriff and the injured cop into an ambulance, while the remainder of the crew stayed behind to try and make sense of the madness. That was almost a week ago now, and things have shown little improvement. The sheriff and his fellow officers are still in the hospital with a combination of multiple broken bones, internal bleeding, and other injuries. They never found Eagle, nor the other hunter which began this whole fiasco. A day or two after the incident, and Tombstone Park was shut down until further notice. It's not been officially posted online or anywhere else. But if you go there, they'll refuse you access. Who they are exactly, I'm not sure, but they've taken full control of the matter now. 2 days after the assault, I was recovering at home when I got a knock on my door. 2 men and a woman all dressed in identical black suits greeted me, and inquired if I'd be willing to answer some questions. They refused to identify who they worked for, which made me turn them down initially. They swore I was not in any legal trouble, and provided a document of the fact. They then leveled with me, and said people are in danger and they could really use my help. So I agreed, and told him essentially everything I've written here today. I asked him what was going on, and who they were, but they avoided the questions with some of their own. They didn't say a lot as I retold my tale, and left soon after as quickly as they had arrived. These last few days, and multiple residents of the town have attested to hearing bouts of gunfire late at night. Before long, Humvees started arriving in the town, with armored trucks, helicopters, even an Abrams tank. Clearly, they aren't taking any chances with whatever is out there. I managed to run into one of the agents for this mysterious enclave that has invaded our town the other night. He was hesitant to say anything, but after I bought him a few drinks his tongue loosened up. I assumed they were Canadian government operatives, but he denied that, claiming instead that they were a private security detail known as Misnomer LLC, essentially mercenaries, but with some truly impressive equipment at their disposal. I asked him what the hell was going on out there, and he admitted things were not exactly under control. Apparently 3 guys had died earlier that day, and the attacks only seemed to be growing. He said that larger animals had since joined in: cougars, grizzlies, wolves, elk, polar bears, and others. He said one guy even claimed to have seen a Bengal tiger out there, but no one could confirm that. He also said that some of the creatures they encountered were like nothing anyone's ever seen, like things that weren't yet known to science. He said that some large hairy bipedal creature had smashed the skull of one of his guys the previous night. They didn't get a good look at it, but it was clearly much larger and faster than them. He also said that something had taken down one of their choppers, and no one had any idea what it was. I asked him what the hell they were dealing with, but he didn't seem to have an answer. He said as far as they could tell, the local wildfire had become infected with some disease, possibly a mutated strain of rabies or prions. He said the animals didn't act aggressive in the day, and seemed to behave quite normally, but at night, all hell broke loose. He too had seen their obsidian eyes, and said they were all like that now. I don't think he's right about that. I don't think this is a disease at all. If it were, then surely Gunny and the other wounded officers would have contracted it as well. Maybe the disease lies dormant in a host for a while, or maybe it hasn't yet made the leap to being capable of infecting humans. But I have another reason for thinking that whatever this is, it isn't the result of some contagion. The way the animals behaved wasn't like they were sick. It was like they were determined and vengeful. The way that bull moose seemed to respond to that strange whistling sound and retreated with the others. It's like they're being commanded by something, like soldiers in some forlorn army. Their attacks are premeditated, coordinated, and ruthlessly efficient, and it leads me to believe that something is organizing them to be that way. There's a group of First Nations people, known as the Athapascan. They have settled these lands for countless generations, long before Canada ever became a country. They have a legend about something known as the Kuruktai, roughly translated as the one who hates. I have a few Athapascan friends, and they've told me that this thing is a malicious spirit. No one knows where it comes from, what it wants, or how to stop it. They say that several hundred years ago, it slaughtered entire tribes near the region, corrupting animals to follow its will. They say it could have easily killed the entire continent if it wanted to, but it eventually just stopped and faded away into the folklore. They still refuse to speak its name, fearful of catching its attention. The more they told me about it, the more I was reminded of that thing I saw in the woods. That has to be it. Every time I think of it, that familiar sense of intense dread becomes palpable in my gut. I just can't ignore the feeling it gave me. I don't know if I believe in the superstitious stories. I don't know if that thing really is the Kuruktai or not. For all I know, it could be an alien, Wendigo, or frickin' spaghetti monster that's causing all of this. I suppose it doesn't really matter what I think, because something out there killed one of our rangers, and a good friend. Eagle deserved better than what he got. All the victims did. As of now, the situation has apparently quieted down in the last few days. The animals haven't launched another attack, and that could mean one of two things. Either this thing has finally been defeated, or it's preparing for a large-scale attack. Pray for us, and hope that the second theory is wrong. Have you ever heard of the Seven Gates of Hell? It's a hugely popular paranormal site in rural Pennsylvania, surrounded by urban legend and horror stories. I always took it for granted how popular that site was, growing up only 15 miles down the road. But apparently, it's a nationwide phenomenon that some people travel hundreds of miles to visit. Now, I've never been one to believe in the paranormal, and not just ghosts and the like. Anything that didn't have concrete evidence that I could see or feel was hard for me. I was just a logically based person. I'm sure you know the type. My friends, however, were all in that phase of young adulthood that involved needing to find proof of some kind of ghost, demon, or otherworldly entity. We were all sophomores in high school, and our evenings consisted of all sorts of ghost hunting adventures, such as going out into the woods behind Maddie's house and using a pendulum to try to speak with a spirit, using a Ouija board, and even trying to create a makeshift summoning portal out of kitchen supplies. None of it ever really worked. Sure, the pendulum swung, but it was windy, and everyone knows that Ouija boards are just controlled by whoever is touching it wanting to make a spooky scene. I was always there, playing along and having fun, but never truly believing anything. That is why when Kenny brought up going to the 7 gates of hell, I was all for it. Aside from the fact that the thing was dripping in paranormal lore, there was an actual story behind it as well. In the early 1800s, there was an asylum in Helena, Pennsylvania. This was back in the days where those that were admitted were not treated great. I don't need to tell you the things that happened to those admitted into asylums before 1900. One evening, that asylum caught fire and started a blaze for centuries. Due to its location in the middle of the woods, it took fire response teams well over 20 minutes to get to the scene. And by that point, well, there was no point. Most of the occupants of Helena Asylum were burnt alive, and while a few escaped into the forest, many were found dead later in the surrounding area due to the smoke inhalation, starvation, or ripped apart by animals. All quite gruesome deaths. I wanted to see the remnants of the asylum that were allegedly still there past the 6th gate. It was a Friday night when we went, leaving our home at 10 p.m., so that we could try to be at the asylum by 3 a.m., the witching hour. There were 5 of us, Kenny, Maddie, Andrew, Lauren, and myself, all piled into Kenny's single-row pickup truck. "So, what are you guys hoping to find out there?" I asked. I know there were supposedly the ghosts of the asylum inmates, but other than that, I didn't know too much about the lore. You know, the usual. Ghosts, demons, whatever wants to show itself to us, Kenny stated matter-of-factly. At first, Maddie and Lauren actually seemed a little tense, which was strange. This was the kind of thing we did all the time. It was Lauren that spoke next. "Well, it depends on how deep into the woods we get. I heard Anders and Lawrence went by themselves last week, and couldn't even get past the 3rd gate. Said that they started hearing voices and seeing eyes in the woods. Spooked them real good." I suppressed a laugh. Anders and Lawrence were basically the class clowns of our high school, and taking anything they said seriously was almost as much of a joke as whatever they said. "Yeah, and I've heard that if you can make it past the 7th gate, then you get sent directly to hell, never to return," Maddie said, her eyes scanning the woods to our right. "Assuming that hell is real, that is," I chime in, achieving a punch to the arm from Andrew. After about a 45-minute drive, we arrive at the broken-down street sign that says Toad Road, the alleged beacon of where the gates are to start. "Okay, everyone, shut up. You all have your flashlights and knives?" Kenny asked. We had been instructed to bring flashlights for obvious reasons, and knives I guess to feel more safe from the ghosts. I know I brought one in case of a coyote, which were more popular in the area than I would like to remember. An actual threat. We all nodded in his direction, signaling our 2 items. "Great, so about 1/8 of a mile in the forest here should be a rusted gate. That is the 1st gate, and once we cross it, it'll be in the devil's territory," Kenny said, with a smirk on his face. "I hope he's ready." I rolled my eyes and shot a smile at Maddie, who was looking a little bit nervous still. I put my arm around her and whispered to her that everything was going to be alright, and maybe they would finally find something of substance, so we can put this dumb paranormal stuff behind us and move on to the next fad. Kenny would soon turn around and lead us into the woods. It took us about 5 minutes to reach the gate that he had spoken of. I honestly didn't see what the big deal was. It was a little bit strange for the rusted iron gate to be sitting in the middle of the woods, not attached to anything and being overgrown with vines and weeds, but scrap metal is found everywhere. There wasn't a huge significance. The others seemed a mixture of elated and nervous at the same time. "So, what is supposed to happen after we cross?" I asked, preparing myself for the made-up shenanigans I'll be experiencing soon. "The first gate isn't much. According to legend, since we are the furthest away from the asylum, there are the least amount of spirits here. They'll likely try to push you around, so you may feel a bit of pressure, but that's about it. Oh, also, our phones will probably go out here. Electronics don't work in the gates, so please stay close. And if you get separated from the group, just go back to the car so you don't get unhelpably lost." I left it unlocked since we are in the middle of nowhere. Kenny banged his flashlight twice on the metal bars of the gate, causing bits of rust to spark into the air around it. Then, with a theatrical performance, he stepped to the other side of the gate. I was next to follow, and then the rest of the group, and unsurprisingly, I felt no different. We walked for a few more minutes and I went to check my phone. It had shut off, which was strange because the battery life had been almost at 80% when we left the car. I guess cell service just doesn't work this far out in the country. "So, all of your phones are actually off then?" I ask, making sure I'm not the only one. One by one they check, and one by one they agree with me. I'm more concerned about us getting pulled apart from each other than the fact that maybe this could be a paranormal interaction. Maddie's particularly freaked out by this. "Guys, I don't know. This feels a little bit too real for me," Maddie said nervously, looking back towards the way we came, probably judging whether the social repercussions of going and waiting in the car and being called a baby inevitably by the rest of the group was worth it. "Oh, stop. It's fine. Worst comes to worst, we all die in a poltergeist extravaganza," Kenny said, not helping. We continued walking. The next gate was about a mile deeper, and we weren't moving super quickly. "So, Kenny, what is supposed to happen?" Ouch! Andrew stopped himself mid-sentence and glanced down at his leg. He pulled up his jeans to mid-calf and revealed a large cut spanning about 4 inches of the backside of his lower leg. "What happened?" I asked, looking around with the flashlight, attempting to find any thorn bushes or other culprit. I felt the light tapping on my shoulder and turned around to see who it was, only to find no one was there. Maddie, Lauren, and Kenny were all standing next to Andrew, and I was alone where I stood. Okay, weird, I'll admit. "I don't know. I was just walking and it hurt. Then this," Andrew said, motioning towards his leg. "I mean, it's not that bad. Just unexpected is all. Let's keep going." We made it to the next gate a few minutes later. Only Maddie complaining of feeling like she was getting shoved to the side. She compared it to when you're walking next to someone who is leaning into you. She was scared though, and placebo is a strong thing, especially in the paranormal, so I chose to ignore that. "Alright, gate 2 is right here. On the other side of this gate, according to legend, you start feeling as if you're being followed. The pushing continues, only stronger. Oh, and there's a cult that guards the 3rd gate at the end. So you know, watch out for them." Kenny, who had apparently not felt any presences during the first gate, was obviously feeling a little more light-hearted, and the rest of the group pressed on without question. It was about halfway through the 2nd gate that we encountered our first problem. Maddie's flashlight died. She swore up and down that she had fresh batteries in it, but nonetheless, we were short one. Maddie huddled close to me and used the light from mine as we continued down the imaginary path that Kenny was leading for us. About a quarter of a mile past the 2nd gate, we heard a scream. I whipped around and saw Lauren on the ground. A wild look in her eyes as she looked back and forth so quickly, I was afraid she might break her neck. We all looked at her inquisitively. I don't know what happened. It felt like someone just spared me," Lauren shouted, panic growing in her voice. I walked over to her and offered her a hand to get up. "I'm serious, guys. It felt like I got tackled. I didn't just dive onto the ground and scream for no reason." Lauren shook off my hand and pushed herself up, rejoining us, shock in her face and Andrew's. Kenny clearly didn't believe her, and Maddie looked like she was on the verge of tears. As we walked, I got the increasing sensation that I was being stalked. I began looking around for the signs of a coyote, attributing the sensation to that, but I couldn't see anything that would alert me to the presence of wildlife. In fact, now that I was thinking about it, there was a surprising lack of wildlife altogether. "Guys, hold up for a second. Be quiet," I asked everyone, and they all were happy to oblige, not that anyone was really talking that much anyway. As everyone stopped, I felt the pit in my stomach start to grow. There wasn't a single noise being made. No crickets, no wind, no leaves cracking in the distance. Complete silence. "That's strange, isn't it? The lack of sound," I stated my concerns aloud. "I really think we should turn back. That feeling of being shoved down, that was enough for me. I don't want to mess with this stuff anymore. I'm serious." Lauren shivered as she spoke, despite the relatively warm night. "Honestly, I'm down to turn around too. It's getting pretty late." Andrew spoke next, his eyes not necessarily frightened, but definitely on edge. "Are you all being serious right now? Come on, we drove all the way here. We are not turning back now," Kenny said, his voice dejected. He threw his hands in the air in a fit. "No, I think we should keep going. I just thought it was weird is all." I threw back. I felt it again, after I said that. The tapping on my shoulder, as if someone was trying to get my attention but didn't want to speak. I turned my head, knowing there would be nothing there, and not being surprised when there wasn't. "How much further to the third gate?" "It should be right around here. Let's go." Kenny swung his flashlight around and started walking again, not giving anyone else the chance to disagree. After another 2 or 3 minutes, we landed back on the road that appeared seemingly out of nowhere. There was no sound of traffic, obviously, and there was no paint on the road. It just seemed like concrete in the wilderness. The feeling of being watched was almost overwhelming now, and I have to admit, it has started freaking me out a little bit at this point. I could see in the distance another gate sitting at the end of the road. This one felt different though. Maybe it was because it was decidedly less rusted and antique looking, or maybe it was because it was in a place that actually made sense for a gate to go instead of being in the middle of the forest. Somehow, it just felt strange. When we were about 10 yards away from the gate, I heard Maddie start to sob. I turned to ask her what was wrong, and I saw utter terror in her eyes. I will never forget that look. I asked what was wrong, and she couldn't even speak. She just pointed to the sides of the roads. In the darkness, where the road dropped off into more grass and trees, sitting just along the edge of our vision were bright green eyes, hundreds of them. It took all of 5 seconds for the rest of our small group to see what Maddie did. Those green eyes, unnaturally bright in the darkness of the forest surrounding them. Lauren let out a shriek, and Andrew just about jumped out of his skin despite not actually making a scream. I swear Kenny actually smiled, as if he was happy to finally have something to talk about. His smile doesn't last. I know he wants to see something metaphysical more than any of the rest of us, but even for him, this felt like more than we bargained for. One by one, what felt like thousands of men stepped out of the shrubbery on either side of the road, each holding some sort of weapon. My heart dropped. Maddie is clinging on to me, her face shoved into my chest, sobbing. Andrew looks distant, like his brain wouldn't allow him to process the situation. Lauren was also crying silent tears, and Kenny had an awful grimace that came from trying to look like he wasn't scared to preserve his social status, and actually shitting his pants. The figures were silent as they approached. They were humanoid in shape, but something about them was distinctly wrong. Maybe it was the way they appeared darker than they should have, even as they got closer and our flashlights could reach them. Maybe it was the way they seemed to float instead of walk as they moved, or maybe it was the noise that emitted from them. It was subtle, a small static-like white noise, but it's amazing how loud things sound when you haven't heard noise at all in the last 45 minutes. 3 of the figures maneuvered themselves between us and the third gate, their gaze never breaking from our own. His hands wrapped around what appeared to be a shotgun, the other 2 clutching giant clubs made of wood and scrap metal. "You'll turn around, now!" The voice didn't come from the man with the shotgun, but rather boomed through the air, as if the world itself were speaking to us. Of course, my initial reaction was to turn around and get right the fuck out of there, as was everyone that was sane in our group. Kenny, however, stared forward with more purpose and drive than I've ever seen. He had finally done it. He had contacted and seen with his own two eyes something from another world. We all had. However, unlike the rest of us, it hadn't frightened Kenny. It made him want to know more. No, we're gonna keep going. This is public land. You can't stop us. I don't believe that you'll pull that trigger. Kenny spoke back to the creatures with a calm precision. He really meant what he was saying, and I couldn't understand how. I fought every urge in my body to turn around and bolt, and I walked forward to put my hand on Kenny's shoulder. We need to go, man. I don't think these guys are fucking around. We need to go. I put emphasis at the end of the sentence, hoping that my good friend was just in some kind of shock-induced state of overconfidence. I turned him around to look at the rest of us, instead of them. Look at Maddie and Lauren. I pointed at the two girls, the former's head in her hands trying to avoid her surroundings, and the latter sitting down next to Maddie, trying to put on a tough face and hardly succeeding. What, do you want to chicken out, just like Anders? This is all just meant to scare us, okay, Daniel? Nothing's gonna happen. A crack once again pierced the night, and I knew instantly that the shotgun had been fired. I didn't even have time to scream before Kenny was gone. I don't mean gone, as in dead. I mean gone. Ceased to be around. There was no trace of him. One moment he was talking to me, and the next my hand was no longer on the shoulder of my childhood best friend, but rather floating through the air back to my side. The figures were gone too. Kenny? Kenny? I shouted into the nothingness. The sound was gone again, along with the creatures, so my voice felt like it would travel miles, but nothing came back. I turned back to everyone else, and they looked as petrified as I was. Where is he, Daniel? He was just right there. You had your damn hand on his shoulder. Daniel, where is he? Andrew was now in front of me, jabbing his finger into my chest as if somehow I was the one that caused this. I started. That is bullshit. Andrew shoved me hard enough that I stumbled backwards and almost fell over. People don't just disappear. His rage quickly dissipated into worry as he walked over to where Kenny was just a few moments before and dropped to his knees. We have to leave now. Tell the police what happened. I don't know. We can't just abandon him out here, Andrew. We have to keep going. It was Lauren that spoke this, the steely look on her face much different than the one she was wearing only a minute ago. She was right. If we left right now, Kenny might as well be dead. He still might be dead, but if we keep going, maybe we can find those creatures again and try to strike a deal. There was nothing I wanted more than to leave this forest and never come back. But at this point, we didn't have a choice. Maddie looked up for the first time since the dark men arrived, her entire face red, and tears staining her cheeks. When she spoke, her voice cracked and she sniffed to try to stop her nose from running to no avail. I don't want to. I just want to go home. She was defeated, and I didn't blame her. However, unless she wanted to walk back through the woods alone, she was gonna have to get through it. Kenny needed us. I'm sorry, Maddie. I know you're scared. We all are. But we have to do this right now. We have to. We have to. I repeated it twice, once for Maddie and once for myself. She looked back at me like a little kid being told she was gonna be spanked, but she nodded her head and let out another burst of tears before eventually standing on her own. Without giving myself any more time to think about it, I walked up to the third gate, put my hand on it, and walked around to the other side. The others followed me, if hesitantly. The road that we had been walking on disappeared directly on the other side of the third gate, strangely enough, so we were back to walking through wooded terrain and keeping our eyes out to whatever may lurk in the trees. I had taken point in Kenny's absence, Maddie staying constantly at my side, followed by Andrew and Lauren. We walked in a tight square forward. It was odd, but for some reason, I just knew where to go. It was as if I was being guided, but by a force that was unseen or unfelt. I found myself making turns around certain trees, and crossing over a small stream at one point that would have been much easier to just walk alongside. The tapping that I'd been feeling on my shoulder previously was also getting stronger, and harder to ignore. It was persistent now, and the taps were becoming harder and more painful. I could tell that the others were feeling something similar. Even though nothing was being said between them, All three of my companions would occasionally grimace and hold a section of their body, or spin their head to look in a direction that had no calling to it. To their credit, especially poor Maddie, no one said a word. We ventured in silence for about 15 more minutes before we heard a scream. It was off in the distance, maybe 50 yards away I would guess, but with a lack of other sound, it was really hard to tell. Andrew and Lauren started running towards the sound call for help, and I was soon to follow. They were slightly ahead of us, and when we passed into a clearing, the two in front of us stopped on a dime, nearly causing Maddie and I to run straight into their backs. Andrew's hand clapped over his mouth and Lauren turned away to vomit. I looked past them, and saw my own mother being stabbed repeatedly by what I can only describe as a monster. It was pitch black like a shadow, with curled blades for hands and lanky canine-looking legs, bent in directions that didn't make any sense. "Mom!" I screamed, mine almost as blood-curdling as hers. I rushed forward and tried to tackle the creature attacking my mother, but right as I was about to lay into it, it too disappeared right in front of my eyes. I turned to find my mother, but she had been replaced with the face of another, an old man with blood running down his lips, looking at me with a devilish smile. He licked his lips as he stared at me, and then vanished himself. It took me a minute before I could move again. I had no idea what was real. Was this all a hallucination? It couldn't be, because, clearly, everyone else saw the same thing as I did. I had no answers, nor any semblance of a clue what to make of the events that had happened. I fought back the urge to scream and vomit, and walked back to our group. "What are we even gonna do, if we find him?" Andrew said, his eyes still trained on the ground where we had just seen two more beings disappear. "We're gonna fucking kill whoever took him." Lauren spoke up. Everything about her turned to ice. It almost made me uncomfortable seeing the sweet, pretty girl, who enjoyed watching makeup tutorials on YouTube and flirting with boys on Twitter, look as hardened and shut off emotionally than it did seeing the spirits. Almost. With a new sense of pace, we started back on the trail. My flashlight flicking back and forth between the trail in front of me and the trees beside me even more often now, and it wasn't long before we reached the fourth gate, or at least I think it was the fourth gate. There actually wasn't a gate at all, but only a prominent mark in the ground, like someone had run their finger through wet concrete and molded it that way. I just knew that it was, however. I knew we were getting deeper into the game, closer to hell, I suppose. I didn't even bother to stop. I just kept walking. The moment I stepped past the gate, I knew I was correct. It felt like it dropped 20 degrees instantly. I also heard sound again, but it wasn't the average forest sounds. It was distant wails that could have been mistaken for a gust of wind in a different situation, but not this one. When Maddie stepped over the line, her face froze and she looked at me. I did my best to smile for reassurance, but I'm sure it wasn't worth much. She put her head back down and pulled her jacket closer around her. "Are we gonna talk about how we made it here? To the fourth gate? With no fucking directions?" Andrew was looking at me, and then pointed back down at the line in the dirt. "I mean, of all the turns we could have taken, all the different routes we could have gone down, this gate is hardly 6 feet long in the forest that's how big? And, how in the fuck did we even know this was supposed to be a gate? I can't be the only one that just knew." Andrew was ranting, something he did to cope with things. Normally, it was when a guy pissed him off at school by talking to a girl he was interested in, or how his favorite football team lost and it was all on the referees. This time, it was about ghosts that kidnapped and possibly killed our best friend. I don't have an answer. Let's just keep moving, okay? I don't want to stand in one place for too long," I replied. "Fuck this!" Andrew crossed his arms and let out a shiver from the newfound cold, but continued to walk ahead of me. Lauren simply walked by his side and looked straight ahead, focused on an unknown point and mind set only on completing her objective. The further we got into the land of the fourth gate, the harder it was to ignore the background sound to our trek. It was clearly screaming, and it was clearly in the direction we were heading. Then again, I guess we had given up a rational thought the moment we decided to continue further into this damned hell forest instead of turning around and cutting our losses at one of us. I know that may sound fucked up to say, but but I'm afraid that even if we make it out of here, our lives will never be the same again. I know mine won't be. I don't really remember when, but at some point, images started flashing through my head. Ones that were not my own. I saw ash and monsters, endless miles of snow, spiders by the millions crawling along the ground. They were terrifying, and would flash in front of my conscience every couple of minutes for a brief moment. It was distracting. I wanted them to stop, and after a while, started cringing every time I knew I was due for another. As we grew deeper, the visions grew longer. Eventually, it became all I could do to focus on walking straight. My gut instinct was to sit down and close my eyes to try to make it stop. I knew that wouldn't help, but I had the strongest urge to do it anyway. I persisted. I kept moving. I trained my eyes on the back of Andrew's head and grounded myself there. It was in the middle of one of these visions, one where I was flying but my wings were on fire, and I knew that soon I would fall to my death, that I heard Maddie scream again. I snapped back to reality and looked to my right, where she had been stationed all evening. She was gone, but not in the way that Kenny had been gone. This time, there was a trail of blood. I don't think that makes it better. Please, help. I followed the voice up a tree and saw Maddie pinned to the trunk, a thick branch penetrating through her stomach. I crossed the distance between us in moments and looked up. She was out of my reach, and her eyes were closing quickly. Maddie, please, stay with us. We can help. I yelled up to her, desperately racking my brain for any solution. I whipped around to find Lauren, climbing a dogwood next to the one Maddie was impaled on. Andrew and I looked on helplessly. I got you, Maddie. I got you. Lauren's voice was reassuring as she worked her way a good 15 feet off the ground to a crossing point between the two trees. I had forgotten how much of a climber Lauren had been in elementary school. It felt like ages ago, but it sure as hell was useful now. Lauren reached over and made the jump. Maddie followed her lazily, a drunken haze settling over her whole body. Lauren began to slowly climb down the level our friend was at, and cradled at her head. She then looked back down at us and shook her head. There was nothing we could do. You have to try, Lauren. Please get her down. I begged. I couldn't handle another loss. Lauren grimaced, and did the only thing that could possibly save her. She broke the branch as close to Maddie's body as she could, and she pulled her off. I'm not sure, actually, if she managed to pull her the whole way off the tree branch. It wasn't long after Lauren touched her. Maddie disappeared into thin air. I have seen and killed real evil. I'm not talking about people. Well, I've killed plenty of them too. But no man compares to real evil. No man is capable of the same atrocities and chaos that real evil inflicts. I hunted giants during my first deployment to Afghanistan, and they're the epitome of evil. I'm a U.S. Army Ranger. I've been serving in Bath for 12 years, and I've seen and killed the scariest shit imaginable. I haven't told anyone for fear of what would happen to my family and me. I lay awake most nights, wishing I could tell my wife what I've encountered, my mind and soul breaking from the weight I have to carry. I relive the horrors every night when I go to sleep. I've kept it all to myself until I found no sleep. I recognized many of the stories posted by my brothers in the Spec Ops and military communities, and realized I finally had an outlet. I've checked in on some of the posters to confirm they're still breathing. I guess the government assumes that no sleep is fake, so they don't monitor it. What I'm about to share with you is all real. You deserve to know what lies in the shadows. You deserve to know what they're hiding from you. And you deserve to know about the men and women that have sacrificed their lives to keep the forces of evil at bay. Skip the next few paragraphs if you're knowledgeable of the Spec Ops community. It's important that you have a basic understanding before I get to the crazy shit. I promise you that the stories that follow will be worth the wait. Army Rangers are a Tier 2 Spec Ops unit, along with Green Berets, SEALs, Marine Force Recon, and MARSOC. Tier 1 consists of CAG, Delta Force, DevGRU, SEAL Team 6, and numerous groups that I won't speak about. There is a value in being unknown to the world. We're often joined by Tier 1 groups from around the world, which are usually the SAS, Brits, Aussies, and Kiwis, and Joint Task Force 2, Canadians. Tier 2 consists of the top 0.1% of the military. Tier 1 generally only recruits the best from Tier 2. We all trained for years for selection, qualification schools. We all possess top secret security clearances, or higher. We're all very good at killing, and we all will forfeit our freedom or lives, and possibly those of our families, if we share what we've done. Our government utilizes Spec Ops units because we work in secret. We're the best. We're well funded, and we can deploy anywhere in the world without congressional approval. Declaration of war. You'd be shocked by how many countries, and which countries, that we're currently serving in. Our track record is impeccable, but usually close to the public. I'm 34, a major, and have been serving in BAT, Ranger Battalion, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, for the past 12 years. I am from Kansas City and a Mizzou grad. I'm currently attending a military school, SGSOC, at Fort Leavenworth while I work on my PhD from Kansas State and await my next deployment to some hellhole. The good news is that I have plenty of time to share my experiences before I head back out. My first encounter with real evil happened during my first deployment to Afghanistan. It was 2009. I remember checking the computers in Kuwait while awaiting the C-130 to take me to Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan. I was excited the Chiefs had just signed Matt Castle, thinking we'd be headed to the Super Bowl soon. Talk about naive. Anything to get my mind off what awaited me. Death, paralysis, loss of limbs. I was 24, just a year out of college, and didn't even have a serious girlfriend. I had a lot to live for. I pushed it out of my mind, leaning on the fact that I'd be leading the baddest motherfuckers on the planet. My Rangers would get it done and I'd make my Baton Rangers proud. I flew into Bagram at 2200 with a couple dozen other soldiers, wearing our IOTVs, bulletproof vests, and ACHs, Kevlar helmets. The C-130 was dark, only the dim green lights illuminating the inside. Those around me glowed an alien green. The pilot gave us a warning to strap in as he began his descent, circling over the airfield and shooting flares to ensure no RPGs could hit us on the way down. Some fobbit whimpered and cried in the corner, while an NCO making eye contact with me yelled at the soldier to stop being a bitch as he rolled his eyes with a small grin. The ramp lowered, slamming hard on the cement runway with a loud metallic crack. I grabbed my gear and head out in the dark. A huge staff sergeant yelled, "LT, get your shit and follow me!" Staff Sergeant Vasquez, 6'5" and built like a brick shithouse, shaved head looking like Hispanic version of The Rock. He led me to the hooch in the Spec Ops gated community on base. It was a storage container, which had 3 sleeping quarters divided by plywood. He told me to throw my gear on and head to the TOC, Tactical Operations Center. The commander had a mission for me. I stood in the TOC, in full gear, M4 hanging from my sling and Glock in the leg holster, looking at the dozens of TV screens and soldiers monitoring radios. The room was full of chatter, too much chatter. Something big was going on. My commander, Lieutenant Colonel LTC Williams, introduced himself, telling me, I was in the big leagues now. Shut the fuck up and do exactly what Captain Stone said. He then ushered me into a side room. I looked around and realized this wasn't going to be a normal mission. Staff Sergeant Vasquez sat at a table with 8 others, their sleeves bare, no Ranger scrolls. I realized it was an ODA, 8-man team of Green Berets. My commander started his brief. Team 329. Team numbers, names changed to protect identities. Went missing approximately 4 hours ago in a desolate portion of the Al-Assay Mountains. Their last transmission came in broken. They were escorting a CIA operative to a cave high in the mountains. We haven't been told anything else. We're sending in Team 357 for search and rescue. LT, you and Vasquez are tagging along. Your platoon is on mission for another few days, so you're gonna get some experience, learning from CPT Stone and his team. The S2 intel officer stepped in and provided as much detail as he could for the mission, while my commander pulled me out of the room. LT, we don't know what the fuck is going on. The CIA are being shitbags as usual. They've left the teams and us in the dark. I want you and Vasquez to gather as much intel as possible while you're there. These fuckers are getting our guys killed and we don't know what for. I met CPT Stone and his team at their vehicles. 3 HMMWVs that had been stripped down. They basically looked like dune buggies with miniguns mounted on top. CPT Stone looked me in the eyes. He had a steely resolve, but there was worry behind his eyes. He raised his hand above his head and said, "LT, aim high." I responded, "Roger, sir. Headshots," gathering that he meant the enemy had body armor on. He looked at me again, fiercely serious, and fully extended his arm above his head. "No, aim high." I nodded and we all loaded into the vehicles. Is he saying they'll hit us from the top of the cave? I remember thinking. I pushed it from my mind as we took off. We left Bagram, still pitch black, wearing NVGs as we rode through the hot desert night. I was constantly scanning the perimeter, waiting to be ambushed on the roads. I looked back at the huge bearded team guys. They were all looking straight ahead. They all seemed to know something that I didn't. They had zero concern for the road and seemed to be a million miles away in their minds. It was as if the real threat far exceeded what we see from the Hajis en route. We hit the Alisay Mountains a couple hours later, pulling into a small combat outpost, COP, and dismounting. "Ammo, grenades, water, and NVGs," is all that Captain Stone said. I grabbed my assault pack as one of the team guys tossed me a few grenades and extra mags. We stepped off from the COP, moving up the mountain in a wedge formation. I remember thinking we were invincible as I looked at these huge warriors carrying M4s, SCARs, M2 sniper rifles, and 203 grenade launchers. These guys had probably taken down entire Al-Qaeda units by themselves. They had the look, the one you earned from taking the lives of other men. I felt like I was superhuman. Little did I know what awaited us. We came upon the cave just as the sun was cresting the moon. The sky was blood red, as the darkness faded into oblivion. The cave looked like the mouth of a giant serpent. The opening was on the other side of a sheer ledge that stood 10 to 15 feet high. As we approached, Captain Stone said, "Eyes up! Keep your distance!" As we got within 100 meters of the cave, I saw something shiny on the ground. I signaled for the squad to halt and called CPT Stone cover. It was a radio. The mic had been ripped off and the radio had a massive dent. Dried black blood caked the side of it. Chunks of skin and tissue littered the area. Captain Stone said, "Shit, James," as his face turned to anger. He stood up as one of the team guys pulled out some climbing gear. He fastened it, and we all climbed the ropes as silently as we could. I was last to climb, cresting the ledge and seeing the squad in the prone, pointing their weapons at the cave opening. As soon as I was up, the squad stood and started to move slowly toward the cave. One of the team guys, took point and took a few steps toward the cave. I was overcome with the worst smell imaginable, like sulfur, shit, and rotten milk. I began to get an intense feeling of despair and hopelessness. It wasn't the adrenaline rush and heightened senses of a normal engagement. It felt evil. Just as he put his hand up to motion for us to stop, I heard the deepest, loudest roar emanate from the cave. It sounded like a cross between a man yelling and the roar of a lion, but blended in an impossible manner. Before we knew it, something huge came charging out of the cave and impaled with a massive spear, lifting him 15 feet off the ground. I looked in amazement at what looked like a huge man. It was absolutely massive, standing 13 to 14 feet tall, its shoulders as wide as I am tall. It had long red hair and a shaggy red beard. It had a loin cloth on and leather sacks on its feet. We were all momentarily frozen. There was an absolute sense of pure, unbridled evil that emanated from this thing. Finally, Captain Stone yelled, "Headshots!" We all unleashed a barrage of rounds into its head and face. 9 soldiers, all emptying 2 to 3 magazines worth of ammo into the beast. It dropped who was still skewered on the spear, and began to charge me, the ground shaking with every step. It looked at me with such cruelty and disdain, open mouth revealing 2 rows of giant teeth. It felt like an ant that was about to be stomped on by a child. It yelled something, in another language, that I didn't understand, its voice splitting my eardrums. As it reached out its massive hand to grab me, it finally fell, riddled with bullets, its head and face caved in. Captain Stone empties another magazine of 7.62 into the giant's head, before going to check on E's body. It took 3 of us to lift the spear and another 2 to pull E's body off the spear shaft, which makes a sucking noise as we pull him off. The spear had ripped out his entire chest cavity. His ribs were splintered and sticking straight out, like crooked, jagged teeth. All of his internal organs lay in a pile on the desert floor. The 5 of us covered in warm, sticky blood. Captain Jones called in the sit rep and requested transport. We all sat down for what seemed like an eternity of silence. Normally, after a mission, we joke around and tell the most inappropriate stories. It's a tradition that makes the horror of war feel a little more acceptable. Today was different. Every eye was glazed over. Everyone sat, facing away from the giant. We had seen, felt real evil. This thing was not a man. Being in its presence brought on a feeling of hopelessness that I can't begin to describe. It was like all of the joy, hope, and good had been sucked out of the world, replaced by despair and agony. We finally stood up and examined the beast. It had 6 fingers on each hand. Its hands were large enough to wrap around my torso. Its mouth revealed 2 rows of teeth, with each tooth being length of my finger. The hair on its head and beard was in a natural shade of red. I wrapped my hands around one of its fingers in an attempt to lift its arm. I couldn't even get its hand off the ground. The spear, still dripping with blood, weighed as much as the logs we use in training, that require 6 men to lift above our heads. We stepped into the cave, seeing hundreds of human bones. Chunks of skin, tissue, and military uniforms littered the pile. In the corner were hundreds of weapons, modern guns like M4s and FALs, rusted out AK-47s, and ancient rotting swords, spears, and shields. It's like it was keeping trophies. An unmarked Chinook showed up 15 minutes later. A bunch of spooks, CIA ops, walked out. One said, "Grab the Neff." The team sergeant yelled, "Fucking clowns! Thanks for the intel." The agents never made eye contact. They unloaded a forklift and cargo net, wrapping up the beast and loading him into the Chinook. Captain Stone motioned for me to come over. I asked if he was doing his closure report, a brief officers have to fill out to summarize battles. He said, "No, wait for it." Shortly after, one of the agents walked over and pulled out a piece of paper. It was a pre-filled closure report, detailing how we had been ambushed by Al-Qaeda. E had been killed before we scared them off. He said, "Sign here." Captain Stone signed and motioned for me to do the same. With a threatening look, the agent said, "You can never speak of this." He turned to walk away and I asked, "What's a Neff?" He paused momentarily, then walked off. When we returned to Bagram, we did a full debrief. Some spook sat in the corner the entire time to ensure we didn't speak about the giant. After the brief, my commander told me to shower and meet him at the smoke pit in 20 minutes. "Ditch your electronics." Lieutenant Colonel Williams handed me a cigar as I approached the smoke pit. He asked me what I had actually seen on mission and then explained to me that 6 other teams had encountered these giants. Most were less lucky than we were. He informed me that he was trying to figure out what the hell they were, and he did eventually. But that's a story for another day. My first engagement with the giant set off a chain of events that brought me to the truth of those evil beings, and many others. After the mission was over, I was approached by one of the team guys. He removed his hat to reveal a kippa underneath. "Sir, do you want to know what that thing said to you when it charged?" he asked. I nodded without hesitation. "It said, 'Son of Yeshua, I will eat your soul.'" He then looked me in the eye and said, "We've killed dozens of these things. We're figuring out what they are, and it's not good. Head out with us on mission tomorrow, and I'll fill you in." "Can I check your ticket, please?" I handed the ticket that I'd been twirling around in my hands for the past hour to the flight attendant. She nodded at it approvingly before producing a sheet of paper from the file that she was holding and placing it inside my folded ticket. "Have a nice flight," she commented enthusiastically before handing my ticket back to me. I grabbed my ticket and stared at the folded sheet of paper inside my ticket curiously before finding my seat. Once I settled down in my seat, I removed a folded sheet of paper from my ticket and placed the ticket in my bag. Upon unfolding the sheet of paper, I realized it was a handwritten note. The handwriting seemed rushed. I've transcribed the note from memory here. Rules for surviving this flight. Do not speak of this sheet to any passenger. You're the only human on this flight. Check the time on your phone after reading the sheet. All rules will apply based on the time of your phone. During the first hour of the flight, do not talk to anyone. People may try to talk to you, but ignore them completely. During the second hour of the flight, you may start talking again, but if anyone mentioned the window, do not look outside the window in any circumstances. If you hear a child crying in the cabin, immediately run to the bathroom. If the screen of your entertainment console suddenly goes black, immediately look away and do not stare at it. During the third hour of the flight, the captain will make an announcement. Follow the instructions. During the fourth hour of the flight, do not sit in your seat. If you make it past the fourth hour, you'll need to spend the rest of the flight evading the chaser. You'll know who the chaser is when you see them. The captain will make an announcement of the plane landing. As soon as you hear this announcement, push your way to the exit door and open it. You'll find that the outside is simply a black void. Jump into it without hesitation. I reread the rules again while chuckling. Did they give one of these to every passenger, or was I somehow randomly chosen for this prank? I checked the time on my phone just to humor the list. 7:13 a.m. So this would be the first hour of the flight. Suddenly a young man walked over to my seat and sat right beside me. I gave him a casual side glance and saw that he was carrying what looked to be a laptop bag. Great, I thought. He'll work on whatever he's doing and leave me alone for the flight. The man didn't even bother to exchange a single word with me as he settled down in his seat and put on his seatbelt. He stared straight ahead and completely avoided me. I let him be and started to fiddle with my flight console. Some people just like to be left alone, I guess. Soon enough, the captain made an announcement of the plane starting, and the steady hum of the plane engine started to vibrate the entire cabin. The plane started to accelerate until the G-force pushed me into my seat. Moments later, I felt the plane rising into the air. I'm typically not scared of flights, but getting on a flight always makes me a bit nervous. This time, though, my stomach was in knots and beads of sweat were running down my forehead. My instincts told me I was stepping into danger, grave danger. I dismissed my thoughts and that awful gut feeling, chalking it down to feeling a little creeped out by the note. The young man on my left suddenly tapped on my shoulder. I jolted up like I'd just been electrocuted. Even through my jacket, his hand felt cold and heavy, like a dead person's hand. I turned around and faced the young man. His face seemed wrong. You know how those realistic human robots can creep people out because of how close to human they are? Yet subconsciously, we can tell that they aren't human. This man was giving me that same unsettling feeling, and his facial features were just artificial in a way I couldn't place. Maybe it was his eyes, a little too big, the pupils abnormally dilated. Or maybe it was his nose, not exactly in the center of his face. Or perhaps it was his mouth, lips way too thin and long. Don't get me wrong, he didn't look obnoxiously fake. In fact, it was those very subtle blemishes in his facial features that made him look like something trying to look like human. And then he spoke. His voice was normal. Upon hearing his voice, the man seemed to look normal too, and I thought I was just freaking out for no reason. "Hey, do you wear headphones?" he asked. That was a weird question to ask. Did he want headphones? I was about to open my mouth to speak when he spoke again. "How would you feel if I cut your hand off right now?" What was disturbing wasn't the nature of the question itself, but the fact that he spoke in such a calm manner. It was as if he was asking me how my day was. Suddenly my mind went to the list of rules that I had subconsciously been squeezing in my hand. The first rule said to not talk to anyone on the flight no matter how much they try to talk to you. I decided to ignore the man. He seemed really weird anyways, and if I was being honest, The list of rules wasn't the reason I chose to ignore him. He stopped pestering me and returned to work on his laptop. I looked over at his laptop slowly and gasped at what I saw on his screen. He had a photo of me on the screen. That's it. Nothing else. Just a full screen photo of me. Before I could process that properly, I looked over at his keyboard and noticed that it wasn't a standard keyboard. In fact, it really wouldn't even count as a keyboard. It was made up of oddly shaped keys, all marked with strange letters that I doubt existed. The man continued to stare intently at the photo of me on his screen. It was then that I realized that the list of rules wasn't a joke. Suddenly, a flight attendant popped out of nowhere and asked me, "Sir, is this man bothering you?" "Yes, he is," I replied before my voice caught up in my throat. In under a second, everyone in the cabin snapped their heads around until they were staring directly at me. Their faces, they all looked wrong, inhuman. Slowly, their long, thin lips curled into wide smiles and red tears started to roll down their faces. What had moments before been a fairly typical flight had now turned into a nightmare. I sat there, cornered in my seat as the entire cabin of people had their faces turned to me, eyes locked with me. Red tears were rolling down their uncanny faces, and their lips were curled into impossibly wide smiles. The flight attendant that had tricked me into talking to her also did the same thing, now completely silent. I waited for them to jump me, to attack me, but they did absolutely nothing. Seconds dragged into minutes, yet the people just stared. They didn't make an effort to move. It looked like they were locked in place, just staring at me. As the initial shock wore off, and my ravaged heartbeat started to slow down, I started to think about what to do. I'd obviously broken the first rule, but apart from being a little unnerved, it hadn't caused much harm to me. The plane's PA system turned on again, and the captain made an announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are coming across some unexpected turbulence. Please remain in your seats to stay safe." His voice was monotone and void of emotion. Every single syllable made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Everyone in the cabin seemed to dismiss my presence at that moment and return to their usual things. The cabin returned to normal, and I nearly convinced myself that I just had a very realistic nightmare. It wasn't until I saw the young man's laptop next to me that I realized it wasn't over yet. His laptop was still the same with a keyboard from another world, and most importantly, he still had a picture of me on his screen. He continued to stare at it, and tapped the keys on his keyboard as if he was typing something. I reread the list of rules and noticed the 7th rule. During the 3rd hour of the flight, the captain will make an announcement. Follow the instructions. The rule sheet stated that the captain would make an announcement during the 3rd hour of the flight. Yet, as I checked my phone, I realized I was still in the 1st hour of the flight. Either breaking the first rule had changed the complete course of things, or the rule sheet simply didn't account for all scenarios. I desperately hoped that the latter was true because otherwise, the precious rules sheet that was supposed to get me out of here would now be worthless. A sudden jolt across the whole cabin interrupted my thoughts. The captain hadn't lied about the turbulence. In fleeting moments, the entire plane was shaking. There was nothing against looking through the window in the rules, apart from during the 2nd hour, so I pulled up the blind on the tiny circular plane window and gasped when I saw the outside. All I saw was a thick black void that seemed to undulate like rich black velvet. I saw the lights from the plane start to get warped and twisted as the beams traveled through the void. Don't get me wrong, the void wasn't just completely black. No, it was full of light rays twisting and warping. The best I can describe the void's movement is like an ocean of thick black waves. My mind went to every sci-fi movie and book I'd ever read, and I entertained the thought that I was inside a wormhole. Or perhaps a black hole. How the regular Boeing plane managed to not get crushed in this physics-bending space was an impossible question to answer. I slowly turned my head away from the window. It took a lot of willpower to look away as if something from those inky black depths hypnotized me. Everyone in the cabin seemed completely oblivious to what was happening and continued to go about their regular business. I checked the time on my phone and my heart skipped a beat. An entire hour had passed in just those few moments I spent looking out into the void. I quickly looked over at the rules sheet to see what I would have to do for the second hour of the flight. During the second hour of the flight, you may start talking again, but if anyone mentions the window, do not look outside the window in any circumstances. While the rule did state it was okay to talk, I really didn't want to talk to anyone in this cabin. I also reread the rule about going to the washroom when I hear a child crying, and also not looking at my in-flight entertainment console if the screen turns black. It all seemed pretty standard stuff, and I thought I'd seen the worst already. This gave me newfound motivation to follow all the rules to the dot and get out of here quickly. I started to head out to the washroom to relieve myself, knowing that I'd be busy during the third and fourth hours of the flight. As I was walking to the washroom, a woman frantically caught up with me. She seemed absolutely frightened. "Hey, are you also stuck here?" she asked while looking me up and down. "Did you also get the set of rules?" I said. "Yes, but I lost the sheet. Can I just read yours?" she pleaded. I considered it for a moment and decided to give her my sheet because she seemed really desperate. It felt good to have someone else be in the same situation as me because now I could rely on someone else to help me out. I gave her the sheet and she thanked me profusely. After giving it a quick read, much to my relief, she handed it back to me. "I'm Sarah, by the way," she said. "Nice to meet you. I'm Ethan," I replied. "We need to get out of here, and I think our best bet is following these rules." "That's right. I'm glad I'm not the only person here on this flight," she said. "About the others, well, they don't seem human to me." She seemed to have calmed down a bit too quickly. It felt like she was putting up a facade, but I chalked it up to being on edge from the situation I was in. "So, I guess we got another half an hour until the third hour starts," she said. We suddenly started to hear the shrill cries of a child in the cabin. She immediately took my hand and rushed us both over to the washroom. There we spent the next few minutes listening to those shrill cries get more and more inhuman as the minutes passed. Just before they finally died down, they were high-pitched shrieks that still ring in my ears to this day. My left ear started to literally bleed as the frequency of the sound ruptured my eardrum. Sarah seemed unfazed by the sound. I guess it affects different people differently. Soon enough, it was the third hour of the flight, and the captain made another announcement in his emotionless monotone voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, please proceed to the front of the plane." Absolutely no one in the cabin moved. I looked at Sarah and she nodded at me, giving me the affirmative to go to the front. We both started to walk to the front of the plane, pacing through rows and rows of people comfortably lounging in their seats. No one seemed to have even heard the announcement. At the front of the plane, I saw the door to the pilot's cockpit open. I walked inside with Sarah right behind me and noticed two things. There was no pilot. Outside the plane, I could see a vast red land, with fire and lava crisscrossing the dried earth like rivers and purple trees dotting the barren landscape. I stared into the outside, shocked at the otherworldly landscape. The place wasn't uninhabited though. Large concrete buildings were concentrated in several areas. Where we had arrived, I had no idea. Sarah started to laugh behind me. It was at that moment that all the pieces of the puzzle clicked together in my head. I realized why Sarah felt so off. She knew what time it was on my phone even though she never checked it. There was no way she could have known which hour of the flight it was unless she had her own phone, which she never did. She didn't get affected by that shrill, high-pitched scream in the cabin. She was acting way too calm, like she knew exactly what was happening. As I felt Sarah's nails dig into my shoulders, I realized that the list of rules had failed me when I broke the first rule. I had changed the course of things and those rules no longer had a time frame. Sarah continued to dig her nails into my shoulders and pierced my skin through my jacket. She leaned in close and whispered, "I am the chaser." I was stuck in a bit of a pickle. The chaser had tricked me and cornered me in the cockpit, and the plane seemed to have traveled into another dimension. I probably would have had a panic attack and mental breakdown at that moment, but I had something more important to deal with. The nails of Sarah, or the chaser I guess, continued to dig into my shoulder and stab through my jacket into my skin. She seemed to possess inhuman strength from the way she easily punctured my jacket and then my skin with just a blunt nail. But as I slowly turned my head around, I realized Sarah was truly just a facade. She had transformed into something else entirely. Her skin had gone completely white like a sheet of paper, and her fingers now ended in jagged, sharp yellow fingernails. Her face had warped into a misfigured eyes, nose, and mouth that barely resembled Sarah that I had gotten to know. I quickly pushed back against her and kind of fell on her to push myself and her out of the cockpit. You don't truly know what you're capable of until you get that adrenaline surge in a survival situation. When your primal instincts take over, you don't think about anything you do. And then as soon as I was free from her grasp, I ran. I won't bore you with the details of the next 30 minutes of me running back and forth around the plane to avoid the chaser. At first, I thought the other passengers would react, maybe catch me or something, but they were all gone. The entire plane was empty, and it was only me and the chaser. I was starting to get tired and lose energy when the captain's voice broadcasted over the PA system once more. "The plane is landing at our destination. Please buckle your seatbelts." The chaser took one final look at me before disappearing to the back of the plane. It puzzled me how the captain was now back in the cockpit and landing the plane. Curiosity overtook me and I thought I'd seen the worst already, so I decided to walk to the front of the plane and check the cockpit again. The door to the cockpit was open, and I could see a single man with his back to me operating the controls. He seemed normal enough, but after what I had experienced on this plane, I knew the last person I wanted to bother would be the captain. I swear I saw him turn his head around and look at me as I turned around and walked back. The plane landed eventlessly, and those emergency rubber slides also opened up to serve as exits in a place where there were no airports. Before I left the plane, I salvaged as much food and water as I could. Some of you may say that I should have stayed in the plane. While that would have been a good move, how long would I last there? Days? At most weeks? It's best I get myself used to this new dimension I found myself in, rather than sit there and then look for food when starving. And of course, I still can't forget the chaser, who I believe is still on the plane. The landscape was an endless red desert. The only things that stood out in the landscape were the occasional purple trees and the towns of concrete buildings. The heat was unbearable. I looked up at the sky and saw 3 large suns in different positions all radiating their heat and light onto this planet. The ground was incredibly dry and I doubt the place ever received rain. In fact, there were several ravines that were filled with lava and molten rock. I knew I couldn't even survive a day in this heat, and had already completely soaked my clothes in sweat. I started to walk over to the closest concrete city I could find. It only took me 10 minutes to walk there, but those 10 minutes were absolute agony as I struggled to keep on walking in the heat. The beams from the 3 suns burnt the skin on the back of my neck and ears as I walked those 10 minutes. Just when I was about to pass out, I found the shade of a concrete building and threw myself into it. The relief was instant. And while that temperature didn't suddenly drop, it was 100 times better than being in the open. I finished an entire bottle of water in one sip and continued to lie down on the floor, nearly passing out from exhaustion and the heat. I didn't notice the suited man when he walked in front of me. "Welcome to hell, lost soul." He said that phrase like he had said it 1,000,000 times and was bored of it. He wore a black suit even in the sweltering heat and didn't seem to be a tiny bit uncomfortable. Hell? I asked, clearly confused at this man's statement. It may have been the heat getting to my head though, because that would have not been confusing to me and would actually explain the previous events. "Yes, son, this is hell. You're an unexpected visit though. Usually we keep track of who's coming in." He said in a tone similar to one a teacher would use when their student asks a dumb question. "Don't worry though, it's not a rare occurrence to have people that come and go. I'm not sure if you'll be able to leave though, so I'll set you up with what you're going to have to do for eternity," he said as if he was just doing his regular job. "What do I have to do?" I asked, unable to fathom what the horrible task must be. "Oh, it's simple. We will take you under the ground where the beings that run your world will consume your fear and eventually your soul as sustenance," he said in a cold tone. I immediately stood up and began to run, but no matter how far I ran, the man seemed to be right beside me. He wasn't running, no, he was just standing still, waiting for me to give up. I tried my best to keep going, but the sweltering heat didn't make it any better. I was far away from the concrete city now, but the man suddenly snapped his fingers and I was back under the shade of the building. "You can't escape," he smiled. That's how I learned the first rule of hell. There's no escape. But I got out, didn't I? How else would I be posting here? All I can say is that I'm incredibly lucky. The man snapped his fingers once more, and we were down in what looked to be a vast underground cellar. I saw people being tortured in each cell by unimaginable creatures. I got a headache looking at those creatures and could not look at them for a long time. The geometry of their bodies did not make sense. They had completely different parts. They weren't even composed of earthly colors. These were new colors that I have no words to describe. I saw a man who was tied down to a bed as an entity peeled his skin off him. His screams carried so much agony that they made me feel the pain. To this day, I will never get the screams in that cellars out of my head. I saw another woman being slowly dipped into lava. Her burnt body seemed to regenerate as soon as she was pulled out. The creature kept on doing it again and again, showing no signs of stopping. As the man walked me through this horrible place, I only had one word on mind. "Why?" "Your souls are very powerful. We feed on your fear and suffering. If we didn't do this, the earth and your reality would not exist. As a return for letting you live a life on the paradise known as Earth, you give us your souls. Don't worry though, this doesn't happen for eternity. Eventually your souls are fully consumed and no more than empty husks. You will find plenty of wasted souls roaming around up above," the man explained. "So, there's no heaven?" I pleaded. "What about God?" "There's no heaven. God has long left your kind behind. He considers your kind a failure, and let us deal with you as we please." I stood there in the underground torture chamber as a suited man told me about the afterlife and how it works. You know what's worse than that, though? Monday mornings. Okay, maybe not. I was quite literally dead, and now this man was gonna chuck me in a cell and torture me for eternity, except that didn't really happen. Don't worry. You really think we waste souls here first? No. We first make them work. Make them keep the barrier between your reality and ours strong, the suited man said, immediately putting away the worst of my worries. Then almost immediately, a weird being made entirely of light appeared next to us. The being did not have a definite shape, and looking at it was like looking at the sun. It seemed to stand there and communicate with the suited man before leaving. With the snap of his fingers, the suited man teleported us away from that chamber, and we were now instead inside what I could only guess were one of the concrete buildings. "There has been a mistake, Ethan," the man said in sorrow. "What happened?" I asked. And then suddenly the world started to warp around me as if reality was a still body of water that was now rippling from an interruption. Colors started to swirl around like watercolor, and before I knew it, I found myself in the plane again with the sheet of rules clutched in my hand and the same young man next to me. I had been given a second chance, and this time, things would be a little different. I immediately looked away from the young man and ignored his cries for attention. I ignored the flight attendant too, and suddenly the whole cabin was yelling at me. Their shouts nearly caught my attention, and made me turn around to tell them to just shut up, but I stayed put and stared at my lap. Suddenly the young man brought his head on my lap and stared directly into my eyes with those uncanny features. I could feel my heart in my throat as he slowly said in my mother's voice, "Ethan," he teased as his voice shifted from my mother's to my dad's, and then to the voices of some of my friends. I trembled and tried to avoid completely disturbing features of his face, so close to me, by closing his eyes, which only made him angrier. It seems the creatures had no way to touch me until I acknowledged them though, so I was safe. The other rules were a breeze to follow except for the chaser one. The chaser was still Sarah, and she started to come towards me as soon as the hour started. I continued to run, but Sarah followed after me, calling for me. I tried to not get myself into a dead end and continued looping around the seats until the hour passed. My legs were tired and I was utterly defeated. Soon the captain made a landing announcement, and this time, I managed to jump into the void. The void accepted me as it started to wrap its tendrils around me. All I could see was a thick, rich, velvety black as I fell and fell for who knows how long. I started to hear the rhythmic beeping of some sort of machinery, and tried to focus on it until I realized what it was. I woke up in a hospital bed, covered from head to toe in casts. Apparently, I had been involved in a serious car crash. The doctors say I was dead for a total of 3 minutes and miraculously survived. You might ask me why I didn't tell the doctors about my experience. They would never believe me. After years of rehab, I gained the ability to be able to do most of the things and life started to become normal again. That is, until the suited man visited me again. It was a cool Saturday evening, and I was going for a walk in the park to try and push myself to improve my health. My athletic ability hasn't been the same since the accident. He walked over to me and I immediately froze as he held his hands up defensively in front of him to signify he meant no harm. "I just want to explain some things," he offered sincerely. "You were never supposed to go to hell, Ethan. It wasn't your time yet. When the soul's time comes, it is taken to hell in a sort of purgatory, you could say. It manifests differently depending on the person, and your own unique purgatory was the plane. The flight attendant that gave you the list of rules realized the error and gave you the list to give you a chance to fight your way out of the purgatory and return to Earth. It was not in our power to return you ourselves, therefore you had to do it. I found you in hell unaccounted for and was ready to put your soul at work when another higher being told me to send you back on the plane and give you a second chance, so you could return," he explained. "Cool, but why do you find the need to tell me that?" I asked. "Because this time, your time has come for real, and I see it a personal responsibility to finish off what we were on to last time," he said as his lips curled into a smile full of malice. I ran away from the man immediately, but I know my death is near. All I can tell you guys is, there's no heaven. Enjoy your life while you have it. So, by this point, everyone is no doubt well aware of the Area 51 memes and all the hubbub surrounding them. Apparently, over 1 million people are set to storm the perimeter on September 20th of this year. Should be interesting, but let's be honest for a second. I doubt it'll happen. And even if it did, even if by some ridiculous miracle they managed to overwhelm the most powerful military on Earth and infiltrate a top-secret base, I don't think they would be exactly thrilled with the results. I'll just come right out and say it, I guess. Area 51 is a red herring. It's a distraction, and it's pretty much always been. Nothing out there but sand, reclusive scientists, and some crusty-ass lake at this point. I mean, think about it. If Area 51 is one of the most top-secret and covert black sites in the world, then why does everyone know about it? How secret can a secret be if everyone knows the secret? For God's sake, even Obama acknowledged its existence a while back. That's the whole point of it. They want you distracted, so you don't look for the others. But why take my word for it? Who am I, anyways? Just some pleb on the internet that decided to cash in on a trend for some clout and perhaps a bit of that sweet, sweet karma, right? Well, yes, but actually no. That may be who I am now, but I was once a person of particular interest to the United States government. Most people knew me as Mr. Blue. Not my real name, but it is easier to pronounce. I used to be a pilot. Did that for many years and loved every second of it. I tell you, there's nothing quite like soaring through the skies and breaking the sound barrier for the first time. You might crap your pants a little, but it's all just part of the experience, really. Now, unfortunately, the type of work I did was above top secret, and for all of our safeties, I can't go into any further detail on what I actually did, or who I actually worked for. One day, I was out on a classified reconnaissance mission in a certain area where I should not have been. I'll apologize here for the vague details of certain things, but you gotta understand. The things I'm about to tell you are beyond top secret. They would kill me 10 times over for uttering a word of it, so here's to hoping that doesn't happen. Anyways, the mission was going as planned, when suddenly my instruments started going berserk on my dash. Air pressure inside the cabin just plummeted, and the speed and fuel consumption gauges looked like they were playing ping pong with each other. Everything began to rattle like crazy, and my alarms erupted into a symphony of irritation. Next thing I know, I see this bright light soar past me at an ungodly speed. The shockwave it produced was so violent that it shredded the hull of my craft. In a split second, I went from casually flying along to suddenly regaining consciousness as I plummeted headfirst towards the ground at terminal velocity. I managed to pull my chute before I splattered, but as I touched down, I almost wished I hadn't. There I was met by an awaiting entourage of at least 24 men in winter camo suits and masks. They all pointed their weapons at me and screamed in a language which I recognized as English. I tried my best to calm them down and appear unthreatening, but that didn't stop them from wrenching me into a pair of handcuffs and hauling me into one of their APCs. They began to drive away, and the real severity of the situation hit me. I was not going to be saved. The people I worked for had never said it, but it was always well known that if ever you were captured, then you were pretty much on your own. With that in mind, I had no real incentive to keep my mouth shut once they started interrogating me. It may seem cowardly, but I was not about to be brutally tortured for a former ally which would never come to bail me out. Yeah, the government says they don't torture people, but trust me, when they really want to know something, there's no tactic too extreme. And they really wanted to know something. So I told them about who I worked for, what my mission was, where I grew up, all that jazz. It was all fabricated, but they took the bait regardless thanks to their severe distrust of the Russians at the time. They were actually pretty cool after that. I mean, they wouldn't let me leave their custody, but that was better than being dead, or at least it was at first. They transported me away from my initial interrogation place, into a secure facility somewhere nearby. I was blindfolded the whole time, but from the rumbling of multiple vehicles, sounds of doors sliding open multiple times, and the distinct feeling of my stomach dropping, I could tell they had taken me somewhere deep underground. Soon after that, I stepped off the elevator and they removed my blindfold. Their leader was a guy with a stern face, thick gray beard and eyes that looked etched from concrete. He wore a black suit, with some symbol upon his hard pocket that I didn't recognize. He stepped in front of everyone and outstretched his arms while staring at me in the eye. "Welcome to your new home." An ever so slight grin slithered onto his face as he said it. I glanced down the dismal gray hallways, which seemed to stretch out further than I could see in multiple directions. They lead me down the hall on the right, past dozens of locked corridors and rooms before ushering me into a cell. My handcuffs were removed soon after, and the door slid shut behind me. The same man that had welcomed me to the facility then approached the window and pushed the intercom button. "We appreciate your cooperations, Mr. Blue. I don't believe there is any reason why our time spent together has to be unfriendly. I apologize for all of this, but you must realize that this is a necessary precaution we must take. I hope you understand." I took a moment, then nodded back to him. "Wonderful. We will have dinner sent to you soon. If you require anything, then please notify one of the guards outside of your quarters." And with that, he and his little entourage turned and strolled down the hallway. That was my very first night in the facility I eventually came to know as FEZ. I don't think it's the official name, but I heard several personnel at the base referred to it by the acronym over the years. I still don't know exactly what it stands for. Forbidden Enclosed Ziggurat? Forsaken Evil Zoo? Forced Ejaculation Zeal? Fabulous Elf Zombies? The best I could really come up with was Fortified Experimental Zone. It makes the most sense too, all things considered. At first, it wasn't actually too bad. The staff was nice, they cooked great food, and there was plenty to see around the base. Although, every once in a while, I would hear the screams just barely echoing through the vents. They interviewed me probably 100 more times after that, and were especially interested in the craft which I was piloting. The craft in question was one of our own top-secret technologies, but unfortunately, it had been blown to smithereens by whatever that light was, so I couldn't tell them much about it. It took years of incarceration there, But eventually the staff came to trust me almost as much as they did their own comrades. We would laugh and joke with one another, and soon enough, we became what some might even consider to be friends. I became especially close with one of the scientists there named Kevin. Kevin was a smart guy, comical too, and explained quite a lot of things to me. He and I would spend hours talking on countless occasions. He was my only real glimpse into what was happening in the outside world. He'd bring in books and movies for us to enjoy together. He kept me updated on everything. And over the next 30 years, we developed a close friendship that I'll always treasure. I must have displayed some kind of intellectual potential, because they eventually started asking for my input on various curiosities stationed throughout the base. They only did it because I had sworn them complete loyalty and would never be allowed to leave the base anyways. But for me, it was just nice to feel included. The base itself was absolutely colossal. They always blindfolded me during transport to any location, but one time I caught a glimpse of the buttons in the elevator. There had to have been at least 50 of them on that panel. I remember the first time they showed me one of the lockdown blocks. There were guards posted at every cell, and I heard some very strange noises emanating around me as we traversed the halls. I thought for sure they were about to show me some horrendous beast from the depths of hell, and prepared myself accordingly as the howls of unseen things echoed throughout the halls. The lead scientist, Dr. Roosevelt, rolled back a two-way mirror curtain and my heart froze from anticipation. In the cell before us, there was nothing more than a human girl in a gray jumpsuit. She was young, maybe 5 years old or so, but there seemed to be nothing out of the ordinary about her. I looked to Dr. Roosevelt, and he flexed his cranial muscles before pressing a button. I heard the sound of gas seep into the room. A few tense seconds passed, when the girl suddenly shrieked like a banshee. Her head tilted back and I saw jagged needle-like teeth emerge from her mouth. Her jet black eyes then lurched toward us, and she lunged at the window. She struck it hard and fell back to the ground, snarling and hissing like some ravenous jackal. Dr. Roosevelt then pressed the button again, cutting the gas and posing a question. "You ever seen anything like her, Mr. Blue?" All I could do was shake my head slowly as I watched the young demon child stalk about on the other side of the glass. "They found her in the woods outside of White Horse with a freshly disemboweled man. She was eating him and appeared unaffected by the sub-zero temperature." I suddenly felt like vomiting, but I said nothing, only stared back at the unusually gruesome little girl. What the hell was she? Unfortunately, I never was told anything else about her, and I doubt the personnel knew much more anyways. They came to show me a lot of very strange things over the years. A giant brownish-orange-haired primate that walked upright and seemed to respond to facial movements. A humanoid-shaped being that was only detectable via infrared equipment. A golden chest that would instantly kill anything that touched it. A 10-foot-tall creature wrapped in vines that emitted bouts of radiation and blended into environments with perfect camouflage. A monstrous fish at least 80 feet in length frozen in nitrogen. Various abhorrent creatures that I'm guessing were the results of relentless genetic tampering. I had never seen anything like it. All of the monstrosities housed there, and the secrets buried in their possession. They also asked for my advice on a certain paradoxical phenomenon that had plagued them as well. They told me that for decades, there had been hundreds of unsolved cases of human disappearances that seemed to defy all explanation. Young children would be found on cliff edges that they could not have possibly reached, while old and frail people would be discovered dozens of miles away from where they had last been seen only a few hours later. Most of them would never be found at all, though. I could almost see the fear dripping from their eyes as they relayed case after case of the recorded incidents, and it was clear, although not said, that they had no idea what the cause was. Unfortunately, neither did I, as it was the first I'd ever heard of the bizarre phenomenon. I told him honestly that I didn't believe my former allies were responsible, but I don't know if that made them feel better or worse. Throughout all of my years there, I'd always found one thing peculiar. After all the weird and terrifying things they showed me, there was never any mention of extraterrestrials. That's what everyone thinks these black site facilities house after all, but nevertheless, they made no mention of it. That made me smile a bit when I thought about it, because they had no idea how close they were. The closest thing they had was this weird tentacle creature with a ringed set of teeth in its mouth. It looked almost like an eel, but possessed 4 iridescent green eyes and a ring around its head. It didn't live in the water either, but instead slithered around on the ground in a very swift and very unsettling motion. They said its DNA resembled nothing like anything they had ever found on Earth before, hence the reason they believed, but were not certain of its otherworldly origins. Kevin and I got to talking back in his quarters one night, as the rest of the crew retired for the evening. He shared with me a bit of his brandy, and we were content to just chat as friends late into the night. He told me a lot about himself that he had never mentioned before. He showed me pictures of his wife and his son that had been taken from him. Kevin admitted his son had died in a car crash a couple years back, while his wife passed 2 years later of cancer. It broke my heart to hear that, and I felt sorrow for my dear friend of some 30 years. Kevin was in his early 50s, but you'd never know with the enthusiasm in his voice. It was during that conversation Kevin ended up mentioning something I found particularly interesting. He told that he believed that if an alien species existed, and were advanced enough to traverse the galactic canopy and reach Earth, then they would obviously be quite intelligent. He said he didn't believe in any of the Hollywood depictions of doomsday aliens hell-bent on destroying humanity. He thought they'd be a lot more subtle than that. Think about it. You find something intelligent which represents almost no threat to you, and the first thing you do is try to kill it? Kevin asked skeptically, as I considered his words for myself. That'd just be a waste, and no species that fancies themselves as advanced beings would do something so brash. At least I hope they wouldn't. He chuckled slightly and shot me a knowing look mixed with a unique intrigue that almost glistened in his gray eyes. Even if they thought we were destroying our own planet or something, why would they care? There are trillions of other planets in the Milky Way alone. They could pick any one of them if they wanted natural resources. I chuckled to myself, almost sensing where the conversation was headed. It's not the planets they're after, I replied. Kevin snapped, and pointed his finger at me with his face lit up. Exactly. They'd want us to study us, learn how we operate, how we organize, and how we live. Kevin's hand motions turned eccentric, and I saw his access badge jostle around his neck. He took another sip of brandy and continued. They'd probably learn more about us than we even know about ourselves. I mean, granted they have to be more intelligent, they could learn up close, understand how humans work. They'd have no need for bloodshed when they could simply, inconspicuously, integrate into human culture. They have no doubt mastered the art of altering their biology to disguise themselves as humans. I mean, that's nothing when compared with the tech they used to get here, you know? He paused from his enthused monologue and wiped the steam off his glasses. I just sat back, content to let him continue, as I found it fascinating that he could know so much. Aliens. They're not warlords. They're poets, architects, authors, musicians, beings that wish to create. It is the ultimate calling for an entity so powerful. Kevin took a deep breath and reveled in his own explanation. His speech had turned a bit slurred, and I could see his eyes floating lazily in their sockets. He then met my eyes in a look that he had never given to me before. It was a look that seemed to shed all sense of formality, and pose a question which he had long since suspected the answer to. You're not really from Russia, are you? The sudden accusation caught me off guard, and I felt my stomach drop like a lead weight. I didn't say anything, and Kevin just scoffed. You had everyone fooled. And I mean, I was too for the longest time. You had a suitable backstory, authentic sounding accent, all the alibis you gave us checked out. He paused and clasped his hands in front of him. You look so authentic too. But there was one thing you missed. One thing that you just can't fake. He looked me deep in the eyes and fell silent. He didn't have to say it, for I already knew what he meant. The eyes are impossible to truly fake. That night your craft was shot down. What were you doing here? Kevin and I maintained a prolonged eye lock before I finally responded. Reconnaissance. For the first time in decades, I dropped the Russian accent, as it was clear there was no longer any reason to lie to my dear friend. And what did you see? Kevin stared into the very depths of my soul as he asked, and I spoke the truth. Beauty, poetry, creators, much like us. Kevin just stared at me for the longest time, as if he were weighing my soul in his mind. I wondered what he planned to do since he had found out, but I didn't ask. Kevin eventually smiled and rose to make his way to the cell door. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a black steel pistol with a long snout. I slowly met his gaze and he chuckled. Mr. Blue, do you wish to go home? I nodded after pausing to think for a moment. Kevin looked over his weapon and primed it for use. I hope your allies can forgive us. Without another word, he flashed his security badge and the locks on the door gave way. He motioned for me to rise and follow, and so I did. Kevin glanced back and forth down the hallway, but due to the late hour, there was no one around. He and I sprinted down the corridor and onwards to one of the security booths. He flashed his badge as I hid just out of sight. He entered the room, and I heard the noise of a brief scuffle before two bright flashes ended it. Kevin re-emerged with wild eyes and beckoned me to follow. He and I dashed down the hallway and reached the massive main shaft elevator soon after. For the first time I entered without a blindfold, and Kevin punched the button to the top floor and the security code required to power it. Security system will be down for a good half hour, but automated distress beacons have already been activated. That gives us about 8 minutes. Kevin dropped the clip from his pistol and popped in a fresh one. I saw spackles of blood on his glasses and cheek, and a frenzied look in his eye. Here, take this. He reached out his hand and held something which I had not seen in decades, the old radio from my craft. I took it, and he and I met eyes as the elevator door opened. It was back to running after that. But a few minutes of it, and we had reached an underground parking facility. Kevin quickly unlocked a nearby vehicle, and the two of us hopped in as he fired it up. The engine roared to life, and Kevin accelerated through the lot. A moment later, and we exited the underground facility, and I saw my first vision of the night sky in over 4 decades. There were men stationed at the perimeter gates that attempted to stop us, but Kevin didn't flinch. He crashed right through the wire fence on the perimeter, causing multiple lights to activate in our wake. I heard a siren blaring behind us, and the silhouettes of people dashing throughout the snow. There's a suit in the back. Put it on. I did as he requested without question, and fit the snug polyester garment over my body. It covered every square inch from foot to the nape of my neck, and felt incredibly comfortable. There's a dial on your right side. You can use it to mask your body heat. They're gonna be after you. He tossed a map into my lap and continued barking instructions. You can contact your friends with that radio, right? His eyes flashed to me as he slid onto the main road and away from the compound. You can contact your friends with that radio, right? His eyes flashed to me as he slid onto the main road and away from the compound. Yes, Kevin nodded. Make your way north. They won't be expecting that. There's a river up there about 30 miles away through the forest. Once you find it, head east until you find a small town. Ask the guy at the post office for Mr. White. He's a friend of mine who's agreed to help you. He'll take it from there. I tried to digest the flow of information as best as I could and remain confident. It had all just happened so suddenly. I stashed you some MREs in the bag. Should last you a good couple weeks. Kevin then swerved around a corner and reoriented us onto a new dark road. In the sudden influx of adrenaline, a sudden though occurred to me. What happens to you? Kevin didn't seem to want to acknowledge the question. Forget about that. Just get back to your people. Behind us, a flurry of lights suddenly ascended into the night sky. The whirring sound of rotary blades then pierced the tranquil canopy of the blustery night. Shit! I'd hoped I could get you a bit farther than this. He suddenly slammed on the brakes. My head lurched forward and the car spun back and forth along the icy road. Take this too. He handed his long barrel pistol over, and I hesitantly took it. He and I then met eyes for one final time. This is where we say goodbye, Mr. Blue. Why are you doing this for me? Kevin sighed, and I saw a certain sorrow swirl into his ironclad pupils. He stayed silent a moment, and only when the sounds of approaching engines grew louder was he spurred a reply. You don't belong here. You don't belong in the cage. I don't know where you come from, but I want you to see the ones you love again. His eyes began to water, and he jostled his neck before looking me in the eye one final time. I hope you don't think of us as captors or kidnappers. I hope you see us as you see yourself. I just hope you can understand. A single tear then rolled down his cheek. I put my hand on his shoulder. I always have, and I always will. Thank you, Kevin. I then held out my hand and he grabbed it tight as we shared one final moment before I ventured into the blizzard. The journey from then on was long and arduous, with me spending weeks trudging through snow and frozen forests. Hounds, men, and machines pursued me for days, but somehow I was able to elude their efforts. The terrain was brutal, but eventually I managed to find the river which Kevin had mentioned. By that point, all of my pursuers had long since gone silent. I followed the river and found a town, and soon after the man known as Mr. White. He was a kind man, and gladly invited me into his house to avoid the agents. It is there that I have been ever since, awaiting my allies' arrival. They were stunned to hear from me again, but not as stunned as I was to find out the radio was still functional. They weren't entirely sure whether they could even trust me anymore, but I didn't leave them much of a choice when I threatened to go public and expose them to the world. They finally agreed, but admitted it would be months before they could reach me. I expected as much, and thankfully Mr. White allowed me to stay with him and await their eventual arrival. I found out soon after that my dear friend Kevin, to whom I owe my freedom and life, had been found deceased. The authorities ruled it a suicide, gunshot wound to the back of the head, but obviously I have my doubts about that. It truly broke me to learn of my one true friend's demise, but I knew it was what he expected. I like to think that is why he chose to do it, and furthermore, it is the reason I'm here posting this now. Kevin's legacy deserves to live on, and this is the only way I know how to do it. And with that, we have come full circle to this message you're reading right now. To address the original topic, Area 51 is indeed a ruse. Kevin held a lot of power in his previous role, and he told me all about the operation. The real prize is the FEZ, my former prison, somewhere in eastern Alaska, buried beneath the snow with all sorts of abhorrent things in its clutches. If you're going to storm anywhere, that should be the place. Just remember to pack a coat. Kevin was a smart man, brilliant even. If you've managed to make it this far, then I'd like to think you are someone like him. Brave, curious, and with an almost innate sense of wonder that cannot be satiated. It is my hope that Kevin's ideas will live on through you. My allies would never approve of this message, but I know now that they are wrong. Truth is something that all sentient beings should be allowed to perceive, despite how unpleasant it may be to hear it. It was Kevin's belief that the beings he knows as aliens are already here. That insisted of murdering humans as is often portrayed in stories, they would blend in. Take keen interest in human culture, society, and art. Write books, poetry, and music in hopes of connecting to something truly extraordinary. Something that reminds them of themselves. If Kevin is right, then maybe one day, you'll even stumble upon such a story for yourself. Maybe you'll think it nothing more than a work of fiction to entertain you for a while. Maybe the author of said theoretical story would seem like nothing more than your run-of-the-mill internet user. He probably wouldn't just come right out and say it, because that would be entirely too corny. He would probably just leave you the pieces, and hope that you could understand the truth for yourself. Maybe you truly are like Kevin, drawn to mystery and prepared to entertain the fantastic. Maybe you'll just dismiss the implications of the words before you, because you don't dare believe something so outlandish. Because in the end, truth is not the problem. Belief is. Maybe someone will understand who. Or more importantly, what I really am. Maybe it'll be you. Either way, I have been away for a very long time. It is time for me to go home. Thank you, Kevin. I'll always uphold our agreement.